CD 7.
He soon discovered that it was nothing like any ladder he had ever climbed. The ropes in both his hands and beneath his feet had a life of their own, and the motion of others on the same set of shrouds made the whole apparatus live. Above him one fellow slipped and was left hanging on by a hand, scrabbling with his foot, and Pearce had the sudden vision of him dropping and taking everyone below with him into the sea. But the fellow managed to get a foothold and began to climb again. Pearce didn't move. He looked over his shoulder, thinking that closer to shore, and in smoother inshore water, to dive from here could put him well clear of the ship's side, with a chance to swim at some speed.
"This is too slow, Mr. Sykes,"
called Barclay, his tone less patient.
"Move, you!"
Sykes snapped at Pearce before replying to the captain.
"'Tis my opinion that more haste makes for less speed, sir."
"I think he means," Lutyens whispered to Emily Barclay, "that one falling man would make his task even harder." "Impossible, I should think," Emily replied.
"I have noted that opinion, Mr. Sykes," said Barclay, "but you will oblige me by following what I now say to be a direct order."
Pearce was well above the deck now, and looking down at Ralph Barclay, he felt a wholly specious sense of superiority. Progress had slowed as each man gingerly negotiated the lubber's hole, affording him a chance to turn again and look at the view, which, while not spectacular, provided some interest, given the low-lying nature of the nearest shore, the great bight of a sandy and muddy bay, and the snow-white cliffs that edged it to the north. For the first time since being brought aboard he had a slight feeling of pleasure, for to be so high and be afforded such a view was agreeable. It was now Ridley's turn to yell at him.
"You there, truculence! Move your ass!"
forcing Pearce to look up and see that his route was now clear.
"Take that man's name, Mr. Thrale," yelled Barclay to the officer of the watch. "I will have no foul usage of language on deck with my wife aboard."
"Women is ever trouble on a ship," said Kemp, still hovering on the gangway just in case he and his rattan were required. Several heads on the forecastle had turned, having heard what the captain said.
"What, like the gunner's wife?"
asked a carpenter's mate kneeling next to Kemp, busy repairing a broken cleat.
"She don't count, fat sow. What about them two lovelies that stowed in the cable tier?"
"They ain't women, they's whores," snarled Kemp, flicking his cane to the poop, not sure if the carpenter was joshing him. It would be maddening if he was not. The idea that some of his shipmates had smuggled women aboard and he was ignorant, for he had long ago learnt that, being unpopular, such things were not vouchsafed to the likes of him. The thought gave extra venom to his next remark.
"I'm talking about a proper woman, like that stood up there with the surgeon, one with ears too gentle for a bit of blaspheme."
"It would perhaps be best if I went below," said Emily in an embarrassed whisper. "I would not want my mere presence to be the cause of a man getting into trouble." "I would advise that," said Lutyens with an upward jerk of his head. "For if we are here to indulge in a touch of observation, we are not alone. Eyes are upon you." Emily looked to the mainmast cap, to where Pearce now stood, obviously looking directly at her. He had on his face the kind of half-amused stare that young men used in a crowded ballroom to let a girl know that she was the object of their interest, and not just the possessor of a dance card. The odd thought popped into her head that such an expression was utterly at odds with the man's station, that he had somehow managed to block out the present surroundings and take her back to a more familiar world. She could almost feel the power of his personality, and it was very disconcerting. Emily dropped her eyes quickly and, blushing, made for the steps that would take her back to the cabin, aware as she left of Lutyens' eyes following her. When the surgeon looked up again, it was to find himself under scrutiny. Pearce, for just a precious minute free to stand and stare, was wondering about this surgeon. Was he as ubiquitous in the officers' part of the ship as he was before the mast, scribbling down anything that took his fancy? Was the captain's wife a subject of that study, and if so, what had Lutyens concluded? He had an overwhelming desire to know what they had been talking about, a craving that found no satisfaction in the face of the man he was staring at.
"Not able," said Rufus Dommett in his ear, breaking that train of thought. "He'll never get up here."
Pearce looked down to see a solitary Abel Scrivens, the last of the group, trying to edge backwards, then lifted his eyes to observe the way Barclay was fixated by the scene before him, standing, feet spread to take the motion of the ship, hands behind his back, exuding impatience. "Hates heights," added Ben Walker. "Always has. He would never do any ladder work." "Then God help him," Pearce replied. "Name?" demanded Sykes of a man who was shaking with fear, backing away, seemingly determined not to go aloft. "Scrivens." "Move, Scrivens," the boatswain growled, "or I will be obliged to fetch over Kemp, who I think you know, to get you to shift." Kemp had already moved from the gangway, drawn to a man who afforded him some gratification when struck, being as he was a right noisy squealer. Sykes did not want to force Scrivens up the shrouds, for to his mind there was no point. Some men could not do it, and there was an end to it, with no good coming of coercion, more likely something dire. Anyone aloft and uncertain threatened not only his own person but those with whom he worked, and no yeoman of the sheets in charge on the ship's yards would thank him for that. He had served with captains before to whom he could have appealed, and left the likes of Scrivens to haul on ropes for eternity. But he had also shared a deck with men like his present captain, who would brook no dissent. Ralph Barclay might not have bothered if he had not been so short-handed, especially in the article of trained hands. To get from his ship what he wanted, every man who had a rating of able or below would have to be of use in every department, on the guns, aloft on the yards, or just hauling on a fall to position a yard.
"Mr. Sykes,"
Barclay called, his voice even, almost benevolent,
"I am aware that your warrant is a new one, and that perhaps you have not clearly understood my order." "I have, sir." "Then be so good, Mr. Sykes, as to follow it to the letter."
It was crude but effective. The boatswain might have sympathy for a man like Scrivens, but Ralph Barclay had just humiliated him in front of everyone by referring to the fact of his recent promotion from boatswain's mate to a full warrant as a standing officer. He could not remove him, promote or demote him, for his warrant came from a higher authority. But to a man who needed to keep the respect of the crew, what had been said should be sufficient to harden his heart.
"Right," he said to his two assistants. "Get this bugger up them shrouds and clout him if he freezes."
Then Sykes turned, upset at his own harshness, and saw that Kemp had come to assist.
"You can stow that rattan, Kemp. You're too free with it."
Kemp had the cane raised, ready to strike at Scrivens' back, but even though he opined that Captain Barclay wouldn't object, he declined to use it in the face of such strictures from a man who was his immediate superior. Scrivens was lifted between Ridley and Costello, and they tried and failed to drag him to the side. Where the scrawny creature found the strength to dig in his heels surprised them, for he didn't budge.
"We'll chuck you in the bloody drink, so help me, you skinny toad, if you don't get up them shrouds,"
snarled Costello, no longer the grinning and jocular fellow he had been earlier. What emerged was very close to a cat's meow.
"I can't."
"You got to," Ridley added, jumping up onto the bulwark and holding out a hand, "for we ain't taking no grief for you being shy." Scrivens kept his hands firmly by his side, and Kemp stepped forward, this time without interference, and swiped him hard. Costello ignored the screaming response and grabbed Scrivens' hand and lifted it to where Ridley could grab it, and with a heave Scrivens was pulled upwards, Costello pushing at his feet to get them onto something solid. "Don't look down," Ridley grunted as Costello joined them on the bulwark, and together they dragged the unwilling Scrivens to a point where they could place his hands on the ropes. What followed was slow, painfully so, each hand and foot movement forced on Scrivens. Getting him through the lubber's hole looked to be impossible until first Pearce and then O'Hagan took a risk to haul him onto the platform, where his mates were quick to congratulate him and tell him there was naught to fear. Standing there, 40 feet in the air, and as white as a sheet, free to look about him and down, swaying on a mast that was moving slowly back and forth through an arc of some 10 feet, Scrivens was promptly sick.
"Enough of this farrago," said Ralph Barclay. "Get those damnable fellows down."
It needed a competent pilot to get HMS Brilliant to a secure berth in the Downs, but it was Barclay's misfortune to be saddled with an idiot who, it later transpired, had got his situation through his connections, not his ability. He very nearly ran them aground before they went half a league, and only a leadsman in the chains, alerting the quarterdeck to the rapidly shoaling water, allowed Ralph Barclay to haul off, obliging him to take charge himself. An anchorage that stretched 5 miles from the bottom of Pegwell Bay to Walmer Castle, with a width of 3 between the treacherous Goodwin Sands and the shingle of the Kent shore, should have had ample room to accommodate a frigate and Davidge Gould's sloop, which was following in his wake. But with hundreds of merchant ships, the components of several convoys, crowded into that space, none of them showing any inclination towards regimentation in the way they anchored, it needed a strong nerve and a skilful crew to get a man-of-war safely to the part of the waterfront reserved for the Royal Navy. Barclay certainly displayed a strong nerve, even though inside he was terrified of public disgrace. His ship, however, did not have the skilful crew it needed, so progress was not only slow but hazardous, with the frigate forced to back topsails half a dozen times to avoid a collision with either a vessel or the taut anchor cable that kept it secure. And all the time his consort, Firefly, looked set to run him aboard across his stern. Several times Davidge Gould's bowsprit came over Brilliant's taffrail. Only exemplary seamanship from Gould in backing and filling, and good fortune for Barclay, saved both vessels from calamity. It was a blessing that the wind stayed light, for in any sort of blow Barclay would have been forced to luff up and drop his best bow wherever he could. As it was, after a scary 2 hours of manoeuvring, in which he and his officers became hoarse with shouting and his crew disgruntled once more at the delay to their dinner, Brilliant, with HMS Firefly in attendance, dropped anchor opposite Deal Castle, just south of the Navy Yard, in that part of the anchorage reserved for King's ships, several of which on the seaward side rode at anchor nearby. No sooner had the metal fluke hit the water than the Admiral commanding at the Downs sent up from his official residence an order for both captains to repair ashore immediately. Pearce, hauling on ropes, running here, there, and everywhere on the frigate's deck, had been praying for a collision as the sails were backed and reset, only to be backed again 2 minutes later. He saw all about him a chance to escape, for sometimes the frigate was a mere 20 feet from the side of another ship, and a hollering, angry, and blasphemous voice telling them to sheer off. He was flabbergasted by the number of craft within view, from enormous vessels flying the flag of the Honourable East India Company that dwarfed the frigate, to craft that looked too small to brave the open sea. The mass of smaller boats bobbing around, transporting supplies or people from ship to shore, was just as staggering, and it was not Pearce alone who looked hungrily at those returning from some errand without goods or passengers. And there, no more than 100 yards distant and plain to the naked eye, was the Deal seafront, rows of tall salt-streaked houses perched on the edge of that steep shingle beach, split by a series of enticing narrow alleyways that promised to take a running man out of sight. What lay beyond that he did not know. More obstacles, no doubt. But since there was no way of foreseeing those, he tried to put it out of his mind. More important was the way the waves hit the beach, leaving a thin strip of darker pebbles. The tide was making, and would help carry a swimming man inshore.
"Mr. Roscoe," called Barclay. "Masterbook, if you please, and my barge. Mr. Sykes, you will oblige me by getting the jolly boat in the water and squaring our yards. Also ensure that no other boat gets anywhere near my ship in the time I am ashore."
"Which is where we all want to be," hissed Charlie. "You black-hearted bastard." He looked at Pearce then, a sort of hunger in his eyes that made the recipient uncomfortable. "This looks more promising than Sheerness, Charlie." "For you, maybe," Taverner responded, with a look and an air that spoke volumes. For a man who could not swim, the small boats slipping by, seemingly so close you could reach out and touch them, and that shingle beach might as well have been a mile away. "If Corney has the right of it, there will be boats right alongside before long." Gerson glared at Pearce then. For the use of that nickname, or for making public what he had only vouchsafed to him, Pearce couldn't say. But those words made him respond to the inquiring looks from the others. "I have it on good authority," "I wonder how you paid for that," said Charlie, smirking.
Stung by that, Gerson replied sharply,
"If I have the sense to seek help and you do not, then that is your affair."
"Tell them what you learned," said Pearce.
Seeing the hesitation, he added, "Or would you rather I did?" Gerson obliged after the merest pause, becoming quite showy in the way he explained. "The crew will be given what wages are owing to them before we sail. It is the custom. After that, Berkeley must allow the men some liberty to spend what they've been paid, and every trader and procurer in deal will come alongside to secure their share. I've been told not to credit this notion of a swift departure, that he has been in the Navy too long to place much store by such orders."
Orders came to get on the capstan bars. Sidling closer to Pearce as they made their way down the companionway, he whispered,
"Why did you speak so?" "It's only fair that we all have a chance," Pearce lied. He wanted them looking at the boats, not him. "We must not jeopardize the possibility our letters will present, which will most certainly happen if any of those fools try to get aboard a boat."
As he pushed to lift the captain's barge, then the jolly boat for the boatswain, Pearce reprised in his mind, now that they were off deal, the inherent flaws in placing any hope in a letter. Gerson's, in plain English, could go straight to a local justice, who might choose to act with alacrity, but his could not. It was addressed to John Wilkes in London, and would have to go by post with the man he hoped to help him having to pay for the delivery. Gerson might be right about the ship being delayed here, but surely not for the days it would need for his plea to arrive and be acted upon. The only thing it might achieve was to blacken Berkeley's name, which would be some comfort. "You're right, of course," he said to Gerson, who was moaning on about what Pearce had done. "Stupid of me. If any of them show an inclination to try, I must stop them. Best you keep an eye on them as well." "Right, boats in the water," called a voice as the rope leading from the capstan went slack. "Strike the bars." As soon as the capstan bars were removed to their racks, a boatswain's mate piped "Up spirits." Pearce watched as some of his mess, Gerson included, rushed off enthusiastically to get their ration of diluted rum. Pearce hung back, half torn for a second between the notion of trying to get off the ship now or getting back to that store with something to break open the padlock.
"You don't seem in much of a rush, mate."
Pearce turned towards the voice and found himself looking up into a scarred and unpleasant face with a well-thumped nose. Close to the prominent, bumpy forehead were small, dark brown eyes, the whole not made any more becoming by the man's attempt at a smile.
"Deveno's the name. Sam to those I call friend."
Pearce just nodded.
"Best friends I have, and many. None be too partial to grog, so for a consideration they allows me to have what they don't require."
With his mind so fixed on escape, the question to ask was obvious. "What kind of consideration?"
"Different from one to another, mate,"
Deveno replied, putting a large hand round Pearce's shoulder. The way he exerted pressure made it obvious this was no gesture of friendliness.
"Some gifted out of kindness, some for a favour, like sorting out some grass-combing bugger aboard who was giving them grief. They know they can rely on Sam Deveno to put matters straight."
The voice changed, becoming gruff as the pressure on Pearce's shoulder increased, bringing Deveno's head closer, so close that Pearce caught a whiff of tobacco on his breath.
"Then there are those who would wish to avoid upsetting me, 'cause I have it in me to be a bad bastard at times."
Pearce was aware that he was trembling slightly. His fists had clenched and his shoulders had stiffened, for he had been threatened with physical violence many times in his life, and he could smell it a mile off. Deveno was telling him that to surrender his rum ration would save him from a beating. Maybe it was those squaring shoulders, or the way that Pearce moved a foot to enhance his balance and give himself room to swing, that alerted Deveno to the fact that this newcomer was not about to be browbeaten, that he would fight if he had to. The thought produced a smile in Deveno, but it was not a humorous one.
"Happen you'll have to wait, seeing as you're a gamecock. If I don't shift, I won't get my own grog, let alone yours. But we shall talk again.
and that might just include a bit of a lesson. Watching Devereux's crouched back, looking at the huge shoulders and the height that prevented him from walking upright under the deck beams, Pearce was looking at a man who had an inch or two on Michael O'Hagan. The feeling he had in his gut as he contemplated having to fight that giant was not one to reassure him. Fight he assuredly would if he could not get off this ship, because it was not in his nature to back down. But just as assuredly he knew that with nothing but his fists he would lose to a bruiser who had the advantage in height, weight, and experience. Kemp's voice, coming from the companionway he'd been about to climb, broke that depressing train of thought, and the smirk on his face was evidence that he had a good notion of what had just taken place. With that sod watching him, he had no choice but to trail in Devereux's wake. The queue had formed before the purser, the master-at-arms, and the small keg from which the rum was being dispensed. Pearce recalled the exchange the Irishmen had had the day before when on the capstan, of the look on both their faces, thinking that it was only a matter of time before that pair squared up to each other. Last in the queue, he saw that Devereux had got himself in behind Rufus Dommett and was whispering in his ear, with not one of the sailors he had walked in front of protesting. He observed Rufus's ginger head half-turn, and fancied he saw fear in the profile. Clearly the man who had tried to bully him was working on the youngest of the Pelicans. Abel Scrivens was behind Rufus, and he would no doubt be next to be told, "If you don't want a beating, give me your grog ration." "Rufus," he called, "come and join me. You too, Abel." Rufus Dommett positively shot back at Pearce's request. Scrivens was slower to react, but looking at Pearce, then following the direction of his gaze, which had him craning to look into the scarred face of Devereux, he soon did likewise. "Happen you and I will have to have words soon, mate," Devereux said, glaring at Pearce. "Very soon." Every head between Devereux and the trio of pelicans had turned to stare, with varying degrees of reaction. Pity, a recognition of stupidity, the odd shake of the head, but more worrying, the fact that by his action Devereux had made him an object of scrutiny just when he wished to be invisible. Last to be served with his grog, Pearce had little choice but to make his way towards his mess table when an over-his-shoulder look from Charlie Taverner alerted him. Turning, expecting danger from Devereux, he was unprepared for Martin Dent skipping by, and a hand jammed under his jug that sent the contents flying all over the deck. His free hand just failed to catch the pest by the shirt as he doubled back towards the companionway and shot up to the upper deck. "You should have broken his damn neck, Pearce," said Charlie, who had left his seat too late to intervene. "Not his nose." The chance came suddenly, as Pearce had always expected it would. An open gun-port, no one in authority close by to intervene, with nearly all of the crew titivating themselves, shaving close, changing into clean clothes, greasing and redoing pigtails, talking excitedly about the women they anticipated would soon be coming aboard, and planning how to thwart the authority that would seek to stop them. Ducking down for a look showed him a clear run to the shore and a sea with waves of a height that would not hamper swimming. There was no time to think of money, coats, shoes, or anyone else, only of the one person who was close to him. "I need your back again, Michael." The Irishman asked nothing, even although he must have guessed what Pearce meant, for there was a look of longing on that broad, ruddy face as he turned away. "Then you have it, and may the blessing of Jesus and the saints be upon you." Pearce was halfway through the gun-port and had one leg over the lip before he spoke. "I will do my best for you all, for which I thank you." Those parting words registered as Pearce's head dipped below the level of the gun-port. He hung there for a second, bent arms holding his weight, very aware of the rough planking through his shirt, looking up, relieved to see no head popping over the side, very aware of what he was risking. The drop to the water was the point at which he would be in greatest danger. The noise of the splash would give him away. At that moment a gun boomed, and as its effect echoed around the anchorage, Pearce straightened his arms and dropped, going under immediately, then resurfacing to spit what felt like 1/2 gallon of seawater out of his mouth. It could be fatal to wait and see if the cannon boom had covered his departure. Registering only the heart-stopping cold that stung his skin, and the horrible taste of salt in his mouth, he struck out, shaking his dripping head to try and catch a glimpse of the shore, for in the lee of the ship there were no waves to tell him in which direction to swim. Sure at any second that he would hear a shout behind him, that the water would zip by his ears with musket balls trying to kill him, he fixed his gaze on the top of one of the onshore houses, noting as he moved, so it did across his vision. The tide was carrying him not only inshore, but to a point up the beach to his right. It mattered not. The shore was the thing. The feeling of intense cold eased as he stroked rhythmically through the water, lifted slightly every few seconds by a wave that helped propel him forward. Close enough to the shore to hear the swish of the waves rushing up the shingle beach, he did not catch the sound of the oars behind him, nor the command to raise them as the jolly boat shot alongside and into his vision. The hand that grabbed his collar stopped him swimming. The oars dipped again, were in front of him, blocking his path, and the voice in his ear was as rough as the grip. "Damn you!" It was the boatswain, Sykes, and Pearce tried to spin his body and use an arm to break the grip. A fist caught on his ear, stunning him slightly as Sykes yelled at him, "Belay that, you fool! You can't get away now!" Treading water, his body lifted out of the water by those muscular arms, Pearce could see very clearly just how close he was to the water breaking over the shore. He tried, by raising his arms, to drop out of his shirt, but a second hand caught his hair and, even wet, managed to hang on to it, while at the same time Sykes grabbed the tail of his shirt and hauled it tight in a way that rendered his arms useless. "Stop struggling, you swab, or I'll fetch you a clout with a spike." Pearce did not obey that command. He did not have to, for he was done for, constrained by the material of his shirt as well as the hand holding his hair. "Now," Sykes growled, "we's going to drag you inboard, and you'd best come easy. Ridley, give us a lift here. Costello, keep an eye on the ship, and make sure nobody in a blue coat spots what we're about." "Still only that useless little bugger Burns on deck. There's a party at the forecastle, but I reckon them to be Truculence's mates." "Which be lucky for you," Sykes said, right in Pearce's ear as he hauled him over the gunwale, the wood of the boat's side digging sharply into his stomach. It must have been Ridley who caught his legs and threw them over, for Pearce found himself in a heap at the bottom of the boat, with a heavy foot firmly placed on his back, and Sykes saying, "Now bloody well stay there." "Anyone paying notice, Costello?" "Not a blind bit, Mr. Sykes, not a blind bit." "Well, our friend here is lucky as well as stupid. Row us back to the ship." The voice became a growl as Sykes leant over to talk into Pearce's ear. "'Cause if they wasn't so busy aboard the barkie, officers as well as hands, thinking of oars on their back, you would have been spotted for certain." "I must get ashore," Pearce said. His voice croaked as much through despair as the sea-water he had swallowed. "Must you now?" Sykes replied, his voice becoming more normal as he sat up. "Well, it ain't going to be on this day. You stay low till we get alongside and set you back through a gunport. Thank your lucky stars that the captain ain't aboard, because he can smell a man trying to run, and his remedy is the lash. Bring us alongside, you two." Pearce heard the slight bump of wood on wood as the ship and the boat met. Once more it was a strong grip on his collar, hauling him upright, and he found himself looking into the screwed-up face of Sykes. "Now, I can see why a man might want to run, especially when he's been had up in the wrong way. But that's the way of things, and it ain't for alteration. You best pass that message on to all your mates." "Please." "Don't even try to plead. Help him, you two, while I hold the boat." Ridley and Costello took his lower legs and lifted him, and Pearce found himself handing his body off the ship's side as he was raised to look through a gunport at the face of Michael O'Hagan. "Would this be in the order of a resurrection, John boy?" As the Irishman grabbed him, he heard Sykes call to the quarterdeck to say he was coming aboard. By the time that happened, Pearce was standing on the main deck, dripping water onto the planking, looking into the disappointed faces of those with whom he shared a mess. Are they disappointed in me, Pearce was thinking, or the fact that I failed? Chapter 10. Ralph Barclay came back on board an hour later with a fair quantity of the Admiral's claret in his stomach, not drunk exactly, but certainly light-headed. Faithful Hale followed behind him as he made his way from his barge up the side of the ship, doing what a good coxswain should to ensure that if his captain missed his footing or failed to clap on to the man-ropes, he would not get his shoes and stockings wet.
"We weigh an hour after the men receive their pay, Mr. Roscoe," said Berkeley in a pleasant tone. "We will take up station to cruise off Dover and ensure that when our chargers weigh at first light, no rascal from the French shore is tempted out to attack them."
"The men will be paid when, sir?"
"This very afternoon, of course," Berkeley replied. "But be warned, before any clerks arrive with their money, I want the anchor hove short, and we will weigh as soon as possible after they depart. The longer we stay, the worse matters will become. I have no intention of turning this ship into Paddy's market for the benefit of the sharps and whores of Deal."
Implementing what he wanted would not be easy. The very necessary act of paying the men before they sailed for the Mediterranean would bring out from the East Kent shore boats by the dozen, selling everything from trinkets through sexual congress to spirituous liquor, even if, with the men new to the service, there was not much in the way of coin to be distributed.
"I will want the gangway up as soon as the clerks go," Berkeley continued, "and marines posted to make sure that neither whores nor drink get aboard."
He knew Roscoe reckoned him too strict in the article of women on board. The Premier had already loudly declared at a wardroom dinner that he had served in ships where they were so prevalent as to almost count as part of the crew, and under captains who saw nothing wrong in taking a goodly number to sea, and to hell with regulations. Even if the harpies fought amongst themselves, at least if the crew's animal passions were contained, there was less fighting between the men. And they performed other useful tasks, even if the ship was in extremis, hauling on ropes to get the vessel clear. What captain, he had demanded, granting the hands that privilege, could deny some license in the article of women to his officers? Overheard by the wardroom servants, the conversation had been relayed to Shenton, and Berkeley's steward took pleasure each morning as he shaved his master in passing on such gossip.
"Did you hear what I said, Mr. Roscoe?"
"I did, sir," Roscoe replied quickly. "No women."
"Quite. The men may trade through designated gunports only, all on the shore side and all with the Marine Guard. Any traders between us and the Goodwin Sands, well, you have my permission to take out the bottom of their boat with a dropped round shot."
Berkeley looked at Roscoe then, wondering if he would protest, knowing he was asking for the impossible. No Navy ship ever left for a deep-sea voyage in anything other than Barbary order. The men got their outstanding pay and did whatever it took to spend it. It was not uncommon for a ship of the line to be held up for days before the vessel could be cleared of unofficial visitors, and even then it was never a clean sweep. Ralph Berkeley fully expected he would find himself discharging more than a couple of whores when they were at sea, which might occasion the dispatch of a boat to get them ashore again. And if the imbibing got out of hand, because too much drink had come aboard, he would have to rig the grating before Brilliant cleared South Foreland. He might know every trick in the cannon, as would Roscoe. They had, as midshipmen, employed every tactic that would be in use this day. But that did not mean they would see the line dropped over the side with a Pearce on the way down and a flagon on the way back up. Nor would they see the bribe, or the threat to one of the red-coated lobsters guarding the gun-ports that would have it open just long enough for a strumpet, with leggings under her skirts full of liquor, to slip through. The purser might prowl in the hope of stopping the purchase of tobacco, which, because he was the shipboard supplier, would eat into his profits. But he would do so in vain. Having issued his orders, Berkeley made his way none too steadily to his cabin. With his mouth beginning to taste like bilge, his first request, after greeting his wife, was that Shenton break out some wine, which the steward was happy to do, seeing it as his duty to take a good taste before serving, to ensure that it was not corked.
"Admiral Wood was most obliging, my dear, but I fear in a terrible rush to get us to sea, so my intention to have him dine aboard and perhaps take you ashore for a return of the compliment will not now be possible."
Emily had seen him like this before, just as she had seen her own father. She reminded herself that she must be tolerant, for men were weak in the article of wine. "That is a great pity, husband."
"Only thing he would not do, damn him! Begging your indulgence, my dear, Was to loosen my orders a trifle. Can't think why.
Did he not vouchsafe you his reasons?
Oh, yes. He's not going to risk upsetting the Admiralty.
It was clear on his wife's face that she did not understand.
Convoy duty is a bloody swine.
The reply was firm and made without prior thought. I fear your meeting with the Admiral has rendered your language a trifle salty, Captain Barclay. That sent his eyebrows up just as it sent her eyes down, for Emily had never, as far as he could recall, even come close to chastising him. But she had now, and in a circumstance that made it very difficult to object. Drink had caused him to blaspheme, and his wife had every right to remind him that it was unacceptable behaviour. That did not make it pleasant, so his admission,
"You are perfectly right, my dear,"
was rather forced.
"I shall explain," he grumbled.
"Please do," Emily replied, giving him a look of deep interest that mollified him somewhat.
"I am obliged by standing Admiralty orders to avoid losing sight of the convoy of which I have charge, so I am tied by apron strings to a bunch of lubberly sods." His hand was up quickly. "I apologize again, my dear, but if you have ever seen the behaviour of merchant captains, you too would have cause to cuss."
Ralph Barclay rambled on, moaning about merchant captains, that they were a contrary lot who could never keep their station, always sailed with the minimum of crew, so that they were laggardly, especially at night, when they would shorten sail in spite of any order he gave not to. That those apron strings would preclude him chasing any potential prize, and that his request to Wood, Port Admiral at Deal, to write some orders allowing him a touch of leeway had been denied.
"Yes, Mr. Burns,"
he said as the midshipman knocked and entered, eyes fixed rigidly ahead, avoiding both Emily's eyes and her welcoming smile. "Mr. Roscoe's compliments, and can he have the muster book back, as the clerks from the pay office are about to come alongside?" "Some of your uniform, Mr. Burns," said Emily, her eye on the coat and breeches, which were clearly too big for the boy, "could do with a touch of adjustment." "Mamma said I would grow into it," Burns replied in a hesitant voice and with a bit of a blush, eyes moving between his cousin and his captain, fearing that he might get a rebuke. Emily's response was to stand up and place herself in front of him. "I'm sure you will, cousin, just as I am sure, like me, she would have you as smart as you can be." "Yes, ma'am." It was virtually impossible not to sigh at the formality, but Emily smiled nevertheless. "If you have spare clothes, as I'm sure you must have, bring them to me, and I will do what I can to make them fit you a little better." Burns was about to say that if his cousin wanted his spare clothes, she had better ask his fellow midshipmen where they had gone. But Ralph Barclay's impatient cough killed the notion, obliging Emily to stand aside so both he and Burns could leave. "That boy is not happy," she said softly to herself. Barclay appeared on deck, book under his arm, and looked over the side, happy to see that his orders had been obeyed, that the bumboats, full of the Deal contingent of whores, pandas, and gimcrack traders, were standing off his ship. Once the men were paid, he would allow an hour's indulgence, not 1 second more. Then he would weigh and sling off the ship anyone who should not be aboard.
"Mr. Hale,"
he called to his coxswain, whispering an order in his ear as he came close. Then he spoke to Roscoe.
"Line the men up." "Down to the orlop with you lot," barked Hale.
A dispirited Pearce, still damp, sat at the back, and so excited no attention.
"Captain Barclay's express orders, and you are to stay there till we weigh."
"What about our pay?" asked Rufus, pointing to the men making their way to the upper deck. Hale shifted his quid of baccy, tipped back his tarred hat, snorted like a hungry pig, and pointed to the scantlings.
"You could turn and ask the plank of wood at your back, and it'd have the answer. But plainly you are thicker than that in the article of brains. The Navy don't pay out on a day and a bit, and any bounty you had is now held on the purser's books. Now move, or do I have to get a file of Marines down here to force you?"
Pearce felt a wave of despair sweep over him. Barclay had made a shrewd move, alert, as Sykes had said he was, to any attempt that his pressed men might make to slip ashore in one of the boats being fended off the frigate's side. The Pelicans were shepherded down the companionway to sit in the gloom of the orlop under the supervision of a less than pleased marine, their spirits of the same order, watching sights that in normal times would have amused, for the 3 hours between the crew being paid and weighing the anchor were pure mayhem, officers shouting, marines being sent hither and thither, sailors, clearly drunk on illicit rum, being chased, while others searched for a corner, not necessarily a quiet one, in which to rut with some whore they had smuggled through a gun-port. Berkeley could be heard all over the ship, cursing, swearing and damning individuals, including his own inferior officers, for their laxity, threatening the midshipmen, who, instead of impeding the crew, seemed more inclined to aid, abet and emulate them. They would, he promised, kiss the gunner's daughter before they saw the French coast. That was when he was not ordering that some woman or trinket trader be chucked over the side. Put to the capstan to finally haul HMS Brilliant over her anchor, it seemed that the Pelicans were the only sober group on the ship. Aloft, topmen, too inebriated to properly perform their duties, made a poor fist of setting the topsails, so that the frigate departed the Downs in the fading daylight like a lubberly merchant vessel with a crew of cack-handed scrapjacks aboard. There was some consolation that Davidge Gould was having the same difficulties in HMS Firefly, but none at all from the jeering hoots which came from the deck of every other naval ship in the anchorage. There was a tense moment as they shaved the shingle off Walmer Castle, watched by a whole regiment of redcoats who filled the beach with their fires. Behind them a tented encampment that filled the surrounding fields, quite enough in numbers to render futile another attempt to swim ashore. A bleary-eyed Berkeley was to be heard screaming a change of course to a helmsman who was, like the others, well under the influence. With the Pelicans now on deck hauling on ropes, under instructions from petty officers made extra crabbed by the effects of drink wearing off, they finally cleared the southern end of the Goodwin Sands. HMS Brilliant made deep water, where, cruising back and forth in the choppy channel water, with a strengthening wind, a full half of the people aboard was sick. The convoy emerged at first light, a long string of some 50 vessels stretched out over several miles, that took hours to get into any form of order. The air was full of endless banging guns, as both frigate and sloop were obliged to sail hither and thither in steadily deteriorating conditions to deliver verbal instructions and threats to merchant skippers, each one of whom saw it as his bounden duty to annoy the captain of HMS Brilliant. Not difficult, as the mere presence of several hundred sailors he was absolutely forbidden to press manning those ships was enough to make him exceedingly irascible. That they took as long as they liked to comply with his orders only added grist to that mill. An angry captain on the deck and officers who took the brunt of his strictures with barely disguised hostility, combined with hangovers and endless orders, naturally meant little contentment 'tween decks, as the misery worked its way down to the lowest on the ship. Martin Dent brought matters to a head, for like a thief who was stolen a couple of times and got away with his crime, he would not leave John Pearce in peace. The Pelicans were working in the holds, fetching out more supplies for the cook, water and casks of meat, in a sea that was far from calm. They were grateful to be below, for there was now a wind blowing that was strong enough to sting the eyes. HMS Brilliant was pitching and rolling quite markedly, and although this might be less obvious below than on deck, they had to take extra care. At the very bottom of the hold, the casks rested in the shingle ballast used to weight and keep steady the hull. Those on top nestled in the space between the two below, and the entire weight pressed down to ensure no movement, with wedges malleted into any point where a barrel could come loose. Being at the beginning of a commission, the holds were full, and the confined space was difficult to work in, especially given the foul miasma created by bilge water, rotting wood, the gases given off by imperfectly sealed meat casks, and the general corruption of a dark, airless compartment that never saw daylight, and where rodents ruled rather than men. There were seamen leading the party, who knew how to cradle each numbered cask in the sling, how to use pulleys to lift and move it without damage to a point where the main lifting tackle could hoist it right up through the hatch. Careful as they were, however, they were also forced to work at some pace, because to stay in the hold too long, with lanterns guttering and flickering from too little oxygen to burn, was to risk passing out from the lack of anything to breathe. With water there was no problem. Any barrel would suffice. But the packed meat was numbered and dated with the time of its butchering, salting, and sealing. In a perfect world, the casks would have come out of the hold in the exact reverse of the way they had gone in. But the ship had victualled in a hurry, and since the purser was adamant about which casks he wanted, those with the longest provenance, the ones most likely to be corrupted if left, a great deal of shifting and stacking was required. After a quarter of an hour in the hold, Pearce was feeling slightly nauseous as he laboured to transfer casks from one pile to another. Each one moved for temporary storage had to be secured by wedges and ropes, for the motion on the ship was such that they could easily begin to roll, and it had been made plain by the purser before they came below, and was now repeated like a chant from his position above the hatch, that any loss through smashed staves would be laid against the name and pay of the offender. Given the weighty nature of the task, Michael O'Hagan was the greatest asset, for although they were too heavy to lift, provided one cask rested against another, he could hold the whole weight of one on his own. He, Pearce, and Scrivens were working together, the former two making sure that impatient members of the crew did not bully Scrivens for his ineptitude. For added to his natural weaknesses, he was still suffering from seasickness. Charlie Taverner, Rufus, and Ben Walker, all three a bit green at the gills as well, formed another working trio, all six cursing Gerson, who had managed to get himself a job easing the casks up on the main tackle, a position where he was required to do no lifting, merely tasked to manoeuvre lashed and weightless casks. And being right under the open hatch, the bastard had proper air to breathe. "Abel," gasped Michael, arms outstretched to hold a moved cask. "2 wedges under this bugger." Scrivens moved slowly, and his use of the mallet was so weak that the wedges were not driven home. In fact, one dropped into the gap between the 2 barrels on which the men were standing. Michael went to a one-handed hold and moved Scrivens to where his other hand had been, coaching him with scant equanimity on how to hold the cask. "Stand there and get both hands on the thing. Right now, stretch right out until your feet are wedged and your arms straight. As long as you stay like that, it will not budge." Michael dropped to his knees to find the fallen wedge. Not easy, for no light penetrated down there, leaving Pearce and Scrivens restraining the cask. The sudden increase in weight was partly due to the dip of the frigate, but Pearce had experienced that more than once already, and he knew that provided they had enough pressure on the cask they were holding, it wouldn't move. This was different. As he and Scrivens pushed hard to hold their position, it seemed that the cask had doubled in weight and was actually pressing down to crush them. Pearce felt his bare feet slip on greasy wood. The barrel had moved and was continuing to do so. What faint light there was showed Abel Scrivens beginning to bend, his thin and already aching back rising to take the rigidity out of his body, and Pearce knew that whatever was exerting pressure on the cask was rendering it too heavy to hold. He yelled to the Irishman, who was on his hands and knees scrabbling about, "Michael, get out!" There was no hesitation from a man who had worked on tunnelling and ditch-digging. When a cry like that came, you shifted without looking, and he was clear on hands and knees within a second. "You too, Scrivens, for we cannot hold it." His shouts brought men to try and aid them, but they were too far away, and Pearce, the veins in his neck feeling fit to burst, called to Scrivens, who was at the end farthest from safety, to save himself. He never knew whether the push Scrivens gave him was motivated by a desire to help or sheer blind panic. There was not much weight in the push, but Pearce, already under pressure, was sent flying out from under the barrel, the rear end of which had already begun to fall. It caught Scrivens, who was stationary, rolling onto his body in an action that seemed to last an age, yet only took a second. The scream that came from Scrivens's throat was cut off as the heavy wooden cask crushed the air he needed out of him. In the glim of the guttering candles in the lanterns, carried by the sailors too late to help, Scrivens's face looked like something from engravings Pearce had seen of a soul entering hell. The silence lasted for another second. Then the air was full of the cries of men trying to effect a rescue. The sling was there quick, a rope attached to it and flung under the end of the cask. Pearce was on his knees beside Michael, both cursing as they tried, in the gap created by Scrivens's crushed body, to get enough purchase to ease the weight. "Bring more light, for Christ's sake," one sailor called, while two more cursed endlessly as they tried to get a line under the cask. "And the surgeon!" A quick knot was tied to the sling and the order given to haul away easy. Slowly the cask began to lift, and there was enough light to see how badly hurt the poor sod was. The light picked up the blood streaming out from about 3 different parts of his body. His eyes were closed, and he was beyond the point of feeling any pain. "Hang on, Abel," Pearce said uselessly, while Michael, who had crossed himself, was praying in a whisper. "For Christ's sake, hang on!" Looking up as if to the heavens and a God in which he did not believe, Pearce looked into the faces of Abel Scrivens's friends. Charlie Taverner had his head in his hands. Rufus had tears in his eyes. Ben Walker was on his knees, face anxious, bird-like eyes fixed on the old man, calling down words of encouragement. "Stand aside." Lutyens pushed Pearce and Michael out of the way and knelt down to touch Scrivens's neck, then lower to search for breath. "There is life still. We need a sling to lift him out, for I cannot attend to him here." More shouts brought a hammock, and Pearce was vaguely aware of the men on the main hoist adding ropes to make a different kind of sling, and the voice of Lieutenant Digby inquiring what had happened. Lifting Scrivens's body was not easy. For all that he was a featherweight, the position in which he lay was awkward, and all who had hands on him knew that they could damage him more than help him. Scrivens's body twitched several times as they moved him, evidence of the deep pain that was penetrating his unconscious state. Slowly, having been placed in the hammock, he was eased out and upwards to the sound of raised voices. "Get that party out of there," said Digby. "The cook needs those casks for the men's dinner," protested the purser. "The men have been down there long enough, sir," Digby insisted. "Apply to Mr. Roscoe for another party to complete the task." It was easy for Pearce to imagine the fat little purser puffing out his toad chest then. "I think you exceed your authority, sir." Digby's response was icy. "Since I have some, sir, and you have none, I think my opinion is the one that will count." "The captain will hear of this." Digby shouted, then his voice every bit as unforgiving as Barclay's. "The captain might be too busy overseeing a burial to listen." Pearce and Michael climbed out to find the two faces close to each other, Digby, red-faced and angry, towering over the purser, who was relenting. "I am merely trying to do my duty, Lieutenant Digby. There is no need to adopt so high a tone." They were by the steps leading up to the orlop deck when Pearce looked back to the officer and the purser, who were now engaged in mutual apologies. He saw Martin Dent slip out through the hatchway, throwing an alarmed look at him before scurrying away, leaving Pearce with the certain knowledge of where the extra weight on that cask had come from. "I suggest," said Michael O'Hagan when Pearce told him, "that you kill that boy before he kills you." Lutyens knew that he was going to lose his patient as soon as he got him onto the table in the sick bay. Probing fingers felt ribs so crushed that internal damage was inevitable, likewise the hips, while the heavy bleeding implied damage to the spleen. It was the loss of blood that took him, for Lutyens, try as he might, could not stem it in time because there was no obvious place to put either a ligature or a tourniquet. He was aware of the men behind him, the big Irishman and the one entered as truculence, and he saw the flash of hate in those eyes when he indicated by a shake of the head and a request for one of them to fetch Lieutenant Digby that his patient was slipping away. Scrivens died before Digby made his appearance, the life going from his inert body without even a last gasp of air. Berkeley was informed and ordered that the body be prepared for burial. Then he consulted his Bible for an appropriate lesson to read out at what would be the first, but certainly not the last, burial service of this commission. "I think it would reassure the men to see me attend, Captain Berkeley," Emily said firmly. "I would not want them to think me heartless."
"As I say, my dear, the choice is yours. No funeral is pleasant, even that of some low creature without much hope of salvation in his life."
That angered Emily, for whoever this Scrivens was, he was the possessor of a soul. "Did you not say, husband, we are all God's creatures, when you advised me that some of your volunteers may succumb?"
The emphasis on the word volunteers was unmistakable. "I did, my dear," Berkeley replied guardedly.
"Then I think that makes us all equal in his eyes, does it not? The poor man is as welcome in heaven as the prince."
Ralph Berkeley responded in a hurt tone, well aware that if anyone else had chosen to speak to him in such a manner he would have bitten their head off. "I cannot help but feel, Mrs. Berkeley, that there is a tone of chastisement in your voice."
"Not chastisement, husband, but pity that you seem to see the man just deceased as somehow unworthy. However," she added quickly, to the shocked look on his face, "I am sure I have misunderstood you, and that it is only the experience of so much death in your profession that makes you sound callous."
"Callous?"
"Perhaps inured is a better word." The men gathered in their divisions, officers in dress uniform, under a grey sky to bury a man few of them knew, and less than half a dozen had cared about when he was alive. But they were solemn, all of them, for in a profession where the risk of death was a commonplace, it was tempting Providence to show anything other than respect. Sewn in canvas, lying on a hatch cover with a piece of round shot to weight down his shroud, Scrivens was not visible to the burial party, so all could imagine him as somehow a better specimen, a bigger and fitter man, perhaps even a younger one, than he had in fact been. "He was good," sniffled Rufus. "Even if he did get on at me, it was well meant."
"Never would have survived on the Thames banks without him," added Charlie Taverner.
"Amen to that," added Ben.
"Silence there,"
said Lieutenant Digby, a command that was soft enough to respect their grief. Berkeley read the burial service, watched by his wife, in a sonorous voice, and Emily was pleased at the mood he struck, mournful but also hopeful, the certainty that the man being buried was going to a better place. She searched the faces of the crew, pleased to see that in the main, by the expressions of piety they wore, they seemed to agree with their captain. That man was born into nothing, and left this earth with nothing. That an all-seeing God would be there to greet him at the gates of eternity to count his virtues and his failings. This poor creature, obviously unsuited to a life at sea, judging by his behaviour in climbing the shrouds, would go to a better place. She could not help but look for John Pearce, for he was an educated man in the midst of a high degree of ignorance, stood between the big curly-haired fellow, who had his head bowed in prayer, a man who crossed himself frequently in the papist manner, and a handsome youth who looked to be crying from the way he dabbed at his eyes. Pearce was doing neither. He was staring straight ahead at her husband and the Bible in his hand, with a look that could only be described as malevolent. There was no piety in that countenance, and the thought that surfaced then was unwelcome. Her husband had pressed these men, his so-called volunteers. They were here against their will. Was there a woman somewhere, a mother, sister, or sweetheart, who would mourn the man's passing? Would they ever know how he died, or where he died? Abel Scrivens should not have been aboard this ship, and if he had not been, he would still be alive. Instinctively, Emily Berkeley knew what Pearce was thinking. that Captain Ralph Barclay had as good as murdered Scrivens, and the real problem she had was that she could not disagree with such a thought.
"And so we commit the body of—"
There was a pause then, as Ralph Barclay had to look at the fly-leaf of his Bible, where he had noted in pencil the name of the deceased.
"Abel Scrivens, to the deep."
The hatch cover had been picked up, taken to the side, and one end laid on the bulwark. As Ralph Barclay intoned the final words of the burial service, the cover was lifted, and with a hiss followed by a splash, the shroud slid into the sea.
"And may God have mercy on his soul."
Emily Barclay had her eyes tight shut as she sought to submerge the words that filled her brain. "And yours, husband. And yours." Pearce had no intention of killing Martin Dent, yet he knew the boy had to be stopped. But how? An appeal to bury the hatchet would be more likely to be taken as an invitation to stick an axe in his head. Would a word to Lieutenant Digby work? Or even, God forbid, Barclay? He didn't know, and he sought out the only person he thought he could ask.
"We all know we Martin," said Dysart, grinning. "A right tyke he is, though liked by the crew, for he will as like as no provide a laugh as much as a mischief."
"He's trying to kill me."
"Och, away, man," Dysart cried. "Has your imagination got the better of you?"
Pearce decided an appeal to national commonality was necessary, even if he risked imparting information in the process.
"You doubt the word of a fellow Scot?" "You a Scot?" Dysart said dismissively. "You dinna sound like one to me."
"I spent most of my formative years south of the border in England."
"Well, it's no done much for your wits."
Martin Dent was intent on avoiding Pearce and Charlie Taverner, staying out of their way until he had another chance to impose trouble. He knew the ship better than his adversaries, the places to hide, and those where to accost him would be public. Every mention of the name underlined what Dysart had said. He was popular, more so than the other ship's boys. It was pointless for Pearce to speculate on the nature of this popularity, though difficult to avoid doing so. He had to stand outside himself and examine the problem objectively, something the Abbé Morland, his French tutor, had taught him always to do. How distant Morland seemed now, and those comfortable days in Paris, the calm of proper study with his soft-voiced abbé mingled with the excitement of an upheaval that truly seemed to make people free. He remembered citizens smiling at each other in the streets, or engaging in fearless and open debate. The common bonds of humanity that culminated in the great festival of the Revolution, when it seemed that everyone in the city had come to the same place with the same purpose, to express their happiness at the present state of their country and their lives. In that great expanse of the Champ de Mars, a huge open field where once soldiers drilled and cannon fired salutes to kings, now filled with flowers, food, flaring torches, dancing, laughing, kissing and embracing commoners, it had been truly possible to believe that the world had changed.
"That sounds like shite to me," said Michael, when Pearce advanced the proposition that there was good in everyone, and that the boy would have been chastened by the death of Scrivens, that he would give up his grudge from mortification at the result of his actions.
Michael took a mouthful of grog before adding,
"The little sod will not stop till he has killed you, and you cannot for your own sake think he will."
"Well, Michael," Pearce replied with just a trace of exasperation,
"if you have any ideas on what to do, I would be grateful."
"Simple," said Charlie Taverner, who felt equally under threat. "Collar him, gag him, and drop him overboard on a dark and windy night."
"That sounds about right," added Ben Walker, with a gleam in his eyes and a tone in his voice that made Pearce reckon him easily capable of killing a fellow human being.
"Murder?" said a shocked Rufus Dommett.
"Preservation," Michael insisted. "Charlie and Ben are right, for if I have learned one thing in my life, it is best to collapse a ditch on a man who is your enemy before he collapses one on you."
"And you believe in God?" said Pearce.
"I do," O'Hagan insisted, "but I have no yearning to meet him before my given time."
"We're all at risk," said Ben, slapping the table with a flat hand. "You do know that, Pearce." The silence that followed allowed Ben to look at each of them in turn, and for the first time Pearce saw, in that serious, troubled face, a degree of determination that underlined how much he was his own man.
End of CD 7. CD 8.
Abel did the boy no harm, yet he died as a plain result of his actions.
If any of us come between Pearce and Dent—
"And me," Charlie interrupted. "Don't forget me."
"we will suffer the same fate as Abel."
Silence greeted that sobering thought as Ben again looked from one to the other, until all four had nodded to acknowledge the truth of what he was saying.
"Then it stands to reason that we all have to have eyes for each other's back. We goes no place alone, and we stay close to each other at all times."
Rufus shuddered. "Christ, Ben, that'd be scary."
"Not scary, Rufus. Deadly, more like, if you don't hearken."
"I think I will try talking to him," said Pearce.
"Try that, Pearce," growled Charlie, emptying his jug. "But I reckon Ben has the right of it, and when you have failed, then help me to chuck him overboard. But that's what I will do if I get the chance."
Silence fell as Gerson approached. It was understood between them, without anything ever being said, that they should not trust him. Martin got Charlie Taverner with the boiling water at an unguarded moment, just as he and Rufus were collecting from the cook their chosen piece of meat, as well as their rations, to make a pudding called duff. Aiming for Charlie's head, his lack of height allied to haste meant he got him on the legs, and although it hurt like the devil when the water penetrated Taverner's ducts, it did not scald him as it was supposed to. Martin was gone before Charlie got out his first cursing screech. The mess kid with the dinner inside dropped to roll on the deck, the boy emerging from behind the cook's coppers grinning like a monkey. That grin faded as Martin saw Pearce and O'Hagan standing in front of him, Ben Walker just behind them. He dodged well left to get outside Pearce, who had to dive across the planking to grab his ankle. Once he got a grip on that, he hauled the boy in, fending off the scrabbling, scratching hands that Martin used in an attempt to get free. Holding him close, he just avoided a bite that would have removed his nose, and with his free hand he began to slap the boy in the face, side to side, not too hard, but enough to stop him struggling.
"I want to talk to you," Pearce said.
"Fuck off!" Martin spat.
"Belay that!"
The bark was from Sam Devereux. Pearce knew that before he looked.
"Take your hands off young Martin, you green-livered swab."
"Young Dent tried to kill me, Devereux," said Pearce, wondering how something so true could sound so feeble. Devereux snorted, then started to move towards Pearce.
"Then the pity is he ain't succeeded."
From the look in his eye, Pearce knew that he was going to have to fight. Was it about grog, or was it about Martin Dent? It didn't matter now. All he could be sure of was that slight tremble shaking his body that always came when danger threatened. "It was him that caused that burial this morning," called Charlie Taverner, emerging from the galley to stand close to Pearce, with Rufus, looking very fearful, just behind him. "And he has just this second tried to maim me." Devereux stopped and glared at Charlie.
"Who asked you to butt your nose in?"
"It's my business too," called Ben.
"Then I'll deal with you," Devereux growled, looking past Pearce, "once I have dealt with this bugger here."
Pearce knew that to wait would be fatal. He reckoned he had no chance anyway, but that would be 10 times worse if he did not get in the first blow. He threw Martin Dent at Devereux's feet, which took the sailor's eye off him for a second, grabbed the second mess kid out of Rufus's hand and slung it at Devereux's head. The man was too quick or too wise. He ducked under and it flew past. The contents, flour, suet and raisins, going everywhere.
"You just shot your boat, mate," he said, rolling up his shirt sleeves to expose thick, matted forearms.
"Kill him, Sam," said Martin Dent with a look of hate quite startling in its intensity. Deveno grinned. "I might just do that, young Martin. Happen there'll be another bit of canvas dropped overboard on the morrow, and a lesson learned by all and sundry of these pressed bastards. But it don't do to be flighty with Samuel Deveno."
"Back away, Pearce," said Charlie, who then looked confused at once more letting slip the name.
"I can't, Charlie."
He was aware of the gathering crowd and of men who had made their way to the companionways without bidding, their task to keep a lookout for anyone in authority. Gerson had come from the table, but sensing what was happening, he stood well to the rear of Ben Walker, who had his fists bunched and a dogged expression on his face, one that said he was willing to take on all comers, and had moved to the edge of the throng. The cook had emerged from behind his galley stove, and his bulk cut off the view from aft. Pearce felt the knot in his stomach, fear mixed with the notion that there was not a soul on this ship who would intervene, and that Deveno might be right. With the sword he could take him, for all his lessons in Paris had not been on logic and philosophy, but he might as well whistle for a seizure as that. Any weapons were locked and chained in racks that could only be undone by the master-at-arms.
"Would the word I'd be looking for be belay?" asked Michael O'Hagan, a quizzical expression on his face as he stepped forward to stand in front of Pearce. "What?" asked Deveno, confused. "Well, now, you stupid sods have this tongue that no Christian can grasp. I want to tell you to lay off, but I know if I speak plain English you'll be too dim to understand it."
"Michael," said Pearce.
O'Hagan half turned his head. "I think what I should say to you, John boy, is stow it."
"This is my fight."
Pearce was still trembling slightly, and he felt it was in his voice too. But he knew from the past that once he started to fight, the trembling disappeared, only to recur more violently once matters were settled. O'Hagan gave him a very gentle backwards push.
"And it will be your hurt for sure, and maybe a maiming."
"Step aside, Paddy," growled Deveno.
"Hold your wind, Deveno," Michael replied without turning, and it was evidence of the respect his size and weight afforded him that the tween-decks bully stood stock still. "Be that as it must," said Pearce, "I cannot let another fight in my place. Yet you can put yourself between that bastard Kemp's rattan and a weaker man's back. That is different."
"I did not have you down for a fool, John boy. Sure, I am going to have words with this ugly bastard at some time,
and it would not, to me, make sense to wait until he had beaten you senseless."
The Irishman grinned. "I had a mind to get you to teach me to read and write, for I am taken with this notion of yours that if I dig a canal I should own it."
"Still," Pearce protested, aware in both heart and head that it sounded weak. "What would you suggest, then, John boy? That I wait till all taken from the Pelican bow the knee to this sod? Not just you, but Rufus, Ben, and Charlie, for he will oppress them all unless he is stopped.
Think on this. It is not just for you, it is for all of us.
For if I cannot get respect here, then not one of us will be safe. And I think if we are to get respect anywhere else on this damned ship, or to ever get off it, you will be the one to bring it about, for which we need you whole."
"I don't follow," insisted Pearce, though he knew in his heart what Michael was driving at.
It made no difference whether he wanted the role or not. The men of mess number 12, with the exception of Gerson, saw him as some kind of leader. He was educated, they were not. He had seen a larger world, and they looked to his knowledge to somehow rescue them from the hand fate had played. Damn it, he could even swim.
"You have the head, and I have the muscle. So, as I said, John boy, stow it."
"Are you pegging on that much longer?" asked Deveno. O'Hagan turned back to stare the man down, cutting off Pearce's last feeble protest.
"Now I have a mind to do this right.
Shirts off, a mark on the deck to go toe-to-toe."
"Suits me,"
said Deveno. "With no one having the right to step in." It was the one-legged cook who answered then, producing from under his apron a huge meat cleaver. I say aye to that, and I will take the arm of any man who interferes, Paddy.
Jesus, Mary and Joseph, said Michael, his voice lilting and wonderfully sarcastic. And here's me thinking that Sam here was universally loved. As they took their shirts off, the proceedings took on a natural formality. A square was formed, a piece of line laid across the deck for the fighters to step up to, and hushed bets were placed. There was no noise, nothing to alert authority to what was none of their business. Pearce looked at the assembled crewmen, at their eyes, trying to see what they thought, hoping that in their hearts they wanted Michael to win, to see a bully humbled, thinking that if they used their heads, they would back the man they knew. The Pelicans were hopeful and keen to let Michael know it, all except Cornelius Gerson, who took care to avoid any notion that he might be involved, showing no desire to exchange a glance with Pearce. He suspected that if asked, Gerson would have backed Devereux. There must be others who would pick up on what was happening, the likes of Sykes the boatswain, or Coyle, the red-faced ex-soldier who had brought them down river, but a look around produced no evidence of their presence. They might be close, but they would stay out of this, as he had seen men of authority do many times in his life with an account that could not be settled any other way. Perhaps the officers likewise would turn a blind eye. Kemp he could see in the crowd, forearming his dripping nose, his rat-like face alight and eager for bloodshed. Ridley, the other boatswain's mate, was there too, his face showing, if anything, a hint of worry. Hale, the captain's coxswain, elbowed himself to a place near the cook, and whispered something in his ear which made the fat, sweating, one-legged fellow wave his cleaver and nod. Then a movement caught Pearce's eye, and behind a stanchion he was sure he saw the popping, pale blue eyes of the surgeon.
"Right," said Costello, the dark-skinned boatswain's mate who had stepped forward to take charge. "You know the rules. As long as your toe is to the line, you are fighting. You may step back to change your toe at any time, but not to delay or rest, for that will mean a forfeit. The first man to fail to stand up to the line for a count of 3 is the loser."
"Michael," said Pearce again, for stripped off, Devereux was even more formidable, a mass of rippling muscles covered with tattoos, anchors, female names, a mermaid, and on his hairy chest a flaming cannon. "I ask again."
"I have been to fairs, John boy,"
Michael replied loudly, jabbing a finger at the tattoos,
"where they have painted ladies like this one here. They are naught to be afeard of."
"Where you are going, Paddy," said Devereux, "you will see more pictures than this."
"Step up,"
said Costello. With his dark complexion, flashing Latin eyes and good looks, Costello had the air about him of a showman. Obviously he had selected himself as the adjudicator, and no one seemed to want to challenge him for that role, which Pearce surmised meant that the crew, who were split in their support, trusted him. Very well, if they did, so could he, and any doubts that Michael would get a fair fight, his last worry, were eased. Both men obliged. Costello stood, hand raised between them, checking the position of their feet. Then, standing well back, for he had no desire to be caught between the first blows, Costello counted
1, 2, 3,
then dropped his arm. There was no rush of blows, more parrying, easing back, ducking and weaving as each man felt the other out. Pearce had got himself a good spot, in the front row, from where he could look, by moving left and right, at the fighters' eyes. Neither man's gaze left the other's face. Whatever body movements they made, they stayed locked on, looking for the first real attempt at a punch, which would come soon. The whole thing was carried out in silence. There was not even whispered encouragement, and Pearce was forced to admire the self-discipline of these sailors, who knew that even quiet goading would make too much noise. It was Michael who threw the first punch, making to move back from a jab, then suddenly coming forward to parry the blow with one hand while he thumped Devereux on his flaming cannon tattoo with the other. The man didn't move, even though it was a well-delivered knock, and Pearce looked at Michael to see what effect this would have on him. All he saw was a grin, which had nothing to do with being pleased, more to do with riling his opponent. Devereux was too long in the tooth to fall for that. But the punch had changed his expression from one of watchfulness to one of determination, his brows closing down over his eyes as he settled himself for what must come, a trading of blows. For there was little science in this. It was pugilism of the most basic kind. When it developed, it was almost rhythmic, made more so by the soft encouragement from a crew who were fighting themselves, to contain their excitement. The sound of landing fists was louder. Michael cut first, above the cheekbone, and that brought a satisfied grunt from Devereux, who made the mistake of trying to follow it up as the Irishman did a rapid change of feet, which left the sailor exposed on his own left side. The shock, as Michael hit him left-handed with a blow that was every bit as telling as his right, registered on Devereux's face, as did the blood that spurted from his gashed eyebrow. Michael hit him with his right before he had time to recover, and forced his opponent to step back for a count of 1. Devereux was toe to the line again in a second, his shoulders now more hunched as he sought to get all his weight behind his punches. With not much chance for guile, Michael's next attempt at a foot change worked more against him than for him, proof that Devereux had, when it came to fighting, natural cunning, for he caught Michael on the upper jaw with a punch that sent him reeling away, then scrabbling back into position with his head shaking. Pearce knew that his friend was on the defensive, parrying blows and ducking away rather than delivering, and he had an eye on the one-legged cook, with a view to snatching that cleaver and going after Devereux, for he was well aware that if Michael were beaten, he would be next. The notion that it was not fair did not enter into his head. Growing up, he had learnt the absolute necessity of winning, and sometimes, when the odds were too heavy, the wisdom of running. To lose a fight was to suffer not only ignominy but pain, and to risk much worse. If he used whatever came to hand to gain a victory, a length of wood, a heavy stone, John Pearce could always reassure himself with the knowledge that all he required was enough submission for his own safety, that, just as he had never abandoned a friend in distress, he had never continued to beat a man who was down. The steady thud of exchanged blows continued for a long time. Michael was weakening. The blows he was giving seemed to have less weight than those he was receiving. Those sailors who had bet on Devereux were trying to increase their stakes. Those few who had backed Michael were attempting to cover what looked certain to be a loss. Devereux seemed confident now, his punches reaching further, nearly overbalancing him as he sought to beat Michael back off the line. That was when Michael did another two-step move and caught the off-balanced Devereux with a haymaker to the left of his head. He got in a second one before changing feet again, this time catching his opponent out because Devereux had changed his own feet to parry the danger from Michael's left hand. "Come on, Michael!" Charlie Taverner got many a sharp look that said, "Shut up." It wasn't much of one because they were enthralled by the contest, now much more even as a recovered O'Hagan put as many blows into Devereux as he received. The tattooed sailor was now forced to take a 2-count break, and several deep breaths before coming back to the line. Michael gave him no respite, but hit him on arrival with a straight jab that caught Devereux right under the heart. Aimed to go through his body and come out the back, it was a huge punch that stopped the other man's breath, most of which came hissing out of his lungs, forcing Devereux off the line for another second. But he was back, trading with Michael in a series of exchanges that seemed to last for an age. It was clear that both men were tiring, their labouring breath mixed with the steam rising off the sweat on their bodies, their faces a mass of cuts and swellings, their lips sliced open in more than one spot. Devereux could hardly see, so gross had those heavy brows become, and with so much blood running into his eyes. Michael was in no better state, but it seemed that his stamina was just that much greater. He might take an age to get his arm up, but it came up all the way, while Devereux seemed only able to reach chest height, not the shoulder height he needed. All the tattoos on his body were smeared with blood now, and it glistened in his thick, matted body hair, as Michael leant into his assault, throwing punches that were 1/10 of the strength he had started with, but had a relentless pressure that drove Devereux off the line 6 times. But he came back until Michael, nearly overreaching himself, summoned up the strength for a killer punch that took the hunched Devereux right under the point of his chin. The cheekbone seemed to pop out to the side as the jawbone went, and Devereux staggered back. He was game. He tried to make the line, but his toe got there just as Costello called the count of 3 and declared the contest over. There was a pause of a few seconds, looks of disbelief on many a face, and Michael O'Hagan sank to his knees, fists out before him. "Charlie, Rufus, hot water," said Pearce, as he knelt beside his champion.
"Now do me a favour, John boy," said Michael thickly through heavily swollen lips. "Get hold of that little shite Dent and throw him overboard."
Chapter 11. The howl of the wind in Pearce's ears, which for hours had doubled the discomfort of his unquiet, empty stomach, died the instant he dropped down the companionway, replaced by the sound of timbers groaning so loud that it was easy to imagine the ship tearing itself apart. That he'd heard it before every time his watch was called on deck, and that the frigate was still afloat, did little to reassure him that he was not about to drown. There was no respite from the motion either, so that he had to clap on to the deck timbers with still blistered hands just to get to the bottom, his bare feet slipping on the dripping wooden steps. Soaked to the skin, he already knew that he had ahead of him 4 hours of deep discomfort, in which sheer exhaustion would, if he were lucky, bring the sleep he craved. It had been like this for 4 days now, the weather steadily worsening as the whole convoy struggled to make some headway down the English Channel in what was heard to be a right true bastard of a sou'westerly. If the meaning of tacking and wearing had been obscure to Pearce at first, it was not so now, as the bowsprit of HMS Brilliant drove left and right, then left again into the teeth of the wind. Roused at 4 in the morning, still wet from the watch they had worked until midnight, Pearce and his messmates had gone on deck in the pitch darkness, the only visible light a reflected glow that lit the faces of the trio of heavily garbed sailors on the wheel. They had come up onto a heaving deck swept by stinging salt spray and endless toil. Occasional relief came from equally hard graft on the capstan, lifting some heavy object into or out of the night sky, or a spell at the pumps to keep the water in the well from rising to a point where it would threaten the frigate's stability. Above their heads, in pitch darkness, the topmen of the larboard watch worked on the sails, jerked endlessly forward, back and sideways by the motions of the hull. On the deck, constantly screamed at by those who had charge of them, Pearce and his fellow landsmen, the lowest of the low, hauled on the ropes that controlled the angle of the yards. Beneath their feet the starboard watch had swung in their hammocks with water dripping on them through the working of the deck planking, trying to get their 4 hours of allotted sleep. Now, roused out, they came back on duty to continue their labours in the cold light of dawn. The experienced hands on Pearce's watch were nowhere to be seen. They had shot below with the speed of men who knew what they were about, to get out of their soaking outer garments and do what they had done the evening before, take up most of the space around the back of the galley fire, which had warmth enough to dry their ducks, heat their limbs, and provide a light for pipes in the only space on the ship where they could smoke. Behind Pearce, framed against the grey sky, Charlie Taverner had collapsed the moment they had made the relative quiet of 'tween decks, only to be kicked by Kemp as he followed him down, each strike accompanied by a swear word as well as a flick from his rattan. Cornelius Gerson had to be prized off the newel post at the base of the stairs so that Pearce could get by, while Rufus Dommett was leaning over at the other side, retching from a stomach that contained nothing with which to be sick, next to Ben Walker, who, head on his chest, was also in some distress. Ahead, in the gloom, Pearce could just make out Michael O'Hagan, legs and hands spread, bent under a too-low deckhead, as he tried to stay upright, and in front of the Irishman, the easily swaying figure in dripping oilskins and a foul-weather hat of Lieutenant Digby. Behind him, looking like a wet-rag doll, and less assured in his stance, stood the diminutive figure of Midshipman Burns.
"Belay that, Kemp!"
Digby shouted, bending a knee to ride the action of the frigate as it crested another wave.
"There is little use in the beating of tired men."
"With respect, sir," Kemp shouted back,
The Premier wants that the new men should know their duty, and in that I'm following his express orders to drive them hard. These men are in my division, Mr. Kemp, and when they are off the deck I will decide how they are to be driven. Now I suggest that you have other duties, and I would be much obliged if you would return to them. Mr. Roscoe, I will speak with Mr. Roscoe Kemp, and unless he issues orders to the contrary, mine will stand."
Kemp had to obey, but the look on his crooked face and the forced "Aye, aye, sir," with which he acknowledged the order left no one in any doubt of his sentiments. "Don't tell me we're shot of the bastard, Michael," hissed Pearce.
"Silence," said Digby. "Those of you who can, help your shipmates to a mess table. 2 men who have the duty to fetch something hot to eat. The rest of you, get out of your clothes, for they will not dry on your backs."
"Nor will there be space by the galley fire," said Pearce, "for there was none yesterday." He remembered just in time to add, "Sir."
"There will be, Pearce."
The use of his real name instead of truculence, the first time anyone in authority had employed it, made Pearce look hard at Lieutenant Digby, who met his gaze with words that were soft but firm.
"You must not lock eyes with me so, man. It is insubordinate."
Pearce continued to do so, a problem the lieutenant solved by issuing orders, for it seemed that the mess carriers were too far gone for the task.
"You and O'Hagan are the least affected. Go to the cook, whom I have already had words with. He will provide you with a couple of kids of soup." As they departed, Digby added, "The rest of you, get your outer garments off. Use your blanket to keep out the chill. And for God's sake, don't seat yourself under a leaking stretch of planking. Once you have something inside you, make your way to the galley, where Mr. Burns here will ensure you get a fair share of the available warmth and a chance to dry your clothes."
"I need sleep," groaned Gerson, a remark that brought a growl of agreement from most of the others.
"You need food," barked Digby.
He then softened his voice.
"Believe me, lads, you must do as I say. It's better to have food and 3 hours' sleep than 4 hours of bed and a 4-hour watch with an empty belly. Taverner, help Dommett there, and make sure he takes in some victuals."
Lieutenant Roscoe, as officer of the watch, had taken station by the wheel, behind the men conning the ship, using their bodies to shield himself from the worst of the wind, though not from the spray which came in as heartily over the ship's windward quarter as it did the bows. Above his head, grey clouds scudded along in the early morning sky, and indistinct in the blowing spume he could just make out a dozen of the convoy ships. 50 more vessels were out there somewhere, including the second escort, which would become increasingly visible to the lookouts as the light increased. He ordered them to search the horizon astern for an East Indiaman, old and much smaller than her more recently built consorts, that had hauled its wind at the last of the light the day before. His captain, mad at the time, forced to put the needs of the majority against the requirements of one ship, would want to know if she had rejoined. To one side he could see Collins, the master, shut up in his little day cabin, poring over his charts in the hope of finding some clue as to their position. Observation had been difficult, with neither a clear sky in daylight nor any sign of a star at night, so all Collins had to go on was dead reckoning, taking the frigate's last certain position when they had lost sight of land off the high Sussex promontory of Fairlight, hard by Hastings, and by calculating from the ship's constantly changing course and speed where they were now. In the hands of a competent navigator, the result of such a calculation was uncertain. In the hands of a man like Collins, it could be fatal. The man should be here on deck with him, keeping an eye on the sails and making adjustments to ease the way on the ship, a task that Roscoe was performing because, if he did not, danger beckoned, as it always did at sea. Midshipman Fairmelow was huddled by the poop steps, looking and feeling miserable, while an oilskin-coated marine stood guard over the door to Captain Barclay's quarters. Around him the ship pitched, rolled and groaned, while the wind set up a constant whistle as it howled through the mass of rigging. Just faintly Roscoe could hear the clanking of the pumps as the men below laboured to rid the frigate of the water she was taking in, water that came through working seams in the scantlings and the decks, or poured in gallons down hatchways and between the boats boomed on the waist. Ahead of him on the quarterdeck, other parties were working on the rigging, it being too rough to clean the decks. Mentally he was checking off the mass of tasks with which he could occupy both them and the watch off-duty throughout the coming day. For bad weather or no, training had to continue. It was nearly imperceptible, but Roscoe sensed by a changed note in the rigging that the wind had eased just a fraction. The possibility presented itself to spread more canvas, which would, in speeding the frigate through the water, ease her passage. Perhaps he would be able to holystone the decks after all, even if it was pointless, because he was sure if he did not do so, Barclay would not only comment on his failure of duty, but would enter the fact in his log. Moving out from the scant protection of the poop, he was in the process of lifting his speaking trumpet to issue orders when a voice called from the tops. "Deck there, firefly signalling."
"Mr. Fairmelow," snapped Roscoe. "The signal book and a glass."
Lanky Fairmelow uncoiled himself too slowly for an impatient premier, and had to scurry when Roscoe barked at him to double up. The light was poor, grey skies full of scudding dark clouds, and the spume set up a fine, all-encompassing mist which, with a group of merchant ships pitching and rolling in the waters between the two warships, made reading Davidge Gould's message difficult.
"Get aloft, Mr. Fairmelow!"
shouted Roscoe, telescope to his eye, straining to see the triangular flags that stood out stiff from Firefly's mainmast.
"And take the book with you."
Then he shouted too for someone to man the frigate's halyards and acknowledge Gould's signals as they were deciphered. Stuffing the book under his foul-weather hat, that being the only place from which it would not disappear, and with the telescope slung by a strap over his shoulder, Fairmelow headed for the rigging on the weather side, fighting to cross a deck pitched at an angle of 15 degrees. Being tall and gangly made it easy for him to get up on the bulwark, and as he began to climb the rigging he felt the security of that wind on his back pressing him into the ropes. Nevertheless, the climb was laborious and clearly too laggardly for the officer of the watch. He could hear Roscoe belabouring him with the epithets of "damned lubber" and "useless bugger." This because he had chosen, with the foul conditions, to get to the safety of the mainmast cap through the lubber's hole. From that secure platform Fairmelow had a better view, and with the bulk of the mast to kill the wind he could risk taking out the signal book from under his dripping hat. Telescope pressed to his eye, he read the still indistinct flags on Davidge Gould's sloop. Flicking through the book, he hesitated to call out what he thought they said, and because he was fresh to the task of signal midshipman, took another look to make sure, which earned him another shouted rebuke from Roscoe. Finally Fairmelow called down to the deck. "Firefly signalling, sir. Enemy in sight."
"Acknowledge!"
shouted Roscoe before turning to the marine sentry.
"Rouse out the captain."
By the base of the mainmast 2 sailors struggled with the signal halyards to get aloft the flags that would tell Gould his message had been read and understood. This would allow him to send the second part of the signal, the bearing on which this enemy lay, as well as some indication of the size of the threat. By the time that had been done, Ralph Barclay was on deck, aware that the enemy was a single ship bearing south-southeast, and that Davidge Gould was asking for permission to engage. Assessing the situation, Barclay stood silently for a full 2 minutes before he issued his orders.
"All hands, Mr. Roscoe, and a signal to Captain Gould to hold his position."
There was no immediate threat. If there had been, Gould would have engaged without waiting for orders.
"Mr. Collins, I need to know our position."
The reply was hesitant. "I would put us at about, let us say, latitude 49 degrees north, longitude some 3.5 degrees east." Ralph Barclay conjured up a mental picture of the long neck of the English Channel as it trended west between the south coast and France, to that point where he could turn southwards once he had weathered the great Atlantic headland off Ushant. Collins' calculations placed the convoy past the Channel Islands and somewhere between the Brittany shore and Devon to the north, closer to the French side than England. Not much distance covered for 4 days' sailing. That was, of course, only true if Collins had the right of it, which, looking into the man's worried countenance, was far from certain. Right at this moment it mattered little as long as he had plenty of water under his keel.
"I need you to shape me a course to get to the southeast of our convoy."
Pearce and Michael O'Hagan approached the galley from the rear. The small space was crowded with a shuffling mass of half-clad sailors standing in a cloud of blue pipe smoke and steam, none of whom showed the slightest inclination to move. Behind the pair, a high-pitched voice, without the least trace of authority or confidence, piped, "Stand aside there."
"By Christ, there's a future admiral come among us," said a jester from the throng, a remark that was greeted with general laughter. "Hard horse and in it."
But they did move enough to let little Burns through, which was nowhere near enough space for the pair following. O'Hagan bunched his fists, but John's voice in his ear stopped him throwing a punch that, given the bruising those hands bore, was like to hurt him more than any victim. Michael's face was less swollen than it had been after the fight, each bruise now black with a yellow surround. The stitching above his badly cut eye was a mess, evidence that Surgeon Lutyens was no master of that particular art. Having beaten Devereux, who was on light duties now with his broken jaw, the Irishman was acknowledged as the hard man of the ship, but the men of this crew had soon worked out that he was nothing like his late opponent. O'Hagan might be a pest when drunk, but sober he had to have a reason to fight, and hated to be thought of as a bully. Devereux had beaten up others for pleasure when he was not doing so to steal their grog.
"We'd be obliged if you would make way, lads," Pearce said to a sea of bland faces.
"Hear that, boys? Truculence has spoken."
"Don't you mean the Dolphin?"
said a voice from the rear.
"I hear tell he swims like one."
"Damn near pierced my ears, Truculence did,"
called one wag, making very obvious that, hardly surprisingly, his true name was common knowledge. Not that it mattered. They were too far from the English shore now.
"Sounds like a bleeding officer," said another voice, before adding a mordant, "Begging your pardon, Mr. Burns."
"Sure as God made trees grow, that little bugger don't sound like one."
"Sounds like a rat, looks like a runt,"
called the jester from the back. Voices came from both sides, the owners hidden by their mates, as Pearce pushed into the mass of bodies, to be greeted by a steady stream of coy, salacious remarks, and a hand that, in the press of swaying bodies, goosed his backside. Pearce could hear O'Hagan behind him, growling at his tormentors, who knew just how far to take the joshing before backing off. On the other side of the crowd they were faced with the cook, red as usual from the heat of the fire underneath his coppers. Burns was eagerly supping from one of the wooden mess kids they had come to collect. He blushed as Pearce looked at him hard.
"For the men, I think, Mr. Burns."
"Carry on," Burns slurped, making it obvious that he had no intention of returning with them, preferring to stay with the heat and the prospect of more food. Pearce took the rope handle of one of the small wooden buckets, passed the other to O'Hagan, and they turned to retrace their steps. Michael O'Hagan stopped before the throng that barred their passage. He passed his kid of steaming soup back to Pearce.
"Right, mates," he said. "If I swing for it, I'll belt the first bastard to lay a hand on these here kids. My mates are beyond freezing cold and wet, and in need of food, and so help me, I don't care a tinker's curse what anyone says."
The crowd parted like the Red Sea in the time of Moses.
"All hands on deck at the double."
The men responded to that command with a speed that surprised Pearce and O'Hagan. Within seconds all the lines that had held damp clothes were empty. What was less obvious was what they were to do with themselves, which was not helped by Burns skipping by and knocking half the contents of one kid onto the deck.
"Get on deck, you pair of slow asses," called Coyle, who was coming along the main deck, repeating the command for all hands. He tried to grab the full kid from John, who pulled it out of his reach. "Don't you know an order when you hears one? Put those bloody mess kids down and get on deck."
"Lieutenant Digby told us to fetch these." The red face went a deeper shade.
"Christ almighty, if I had a starter now, you'd feel it."
The cook intervened, stomping over to push Coyle on his way and get about his duties before he turned his sweating face to Pearce.
All hands, you stupid half-brick, means what it says. Everyone on deck at the double, 'cause the captain apprehends danger. Do yourself a favour and fill your mouths, but if you don't want the cat's skin in your backs, move your arse." "We'll take them with us," said Pearce. "You ain't even half a brick," shouted the cook at their retreating backs. They were the last on deck, and they found the others already hauling on the falls to the leeward side of the quarter-deck. Rising and falling 20 feet on each wave, bare feet slipping on the planking, they were seeking to bring the yards round to take more wind, which earned them many a curse from their shipmates. All was confusion, and, taking advantage of that, Pearce, followed by O'Hagan, walked along the line of heaving men and lifted the heavy wooden kid to each pair of lips. "A good idea, Pearce," shouted Digby from the rear. "Make sure every man has something, and if they refuse, force it down their throats." He made his way down the line, feeding Taverner and Ben Walker in turn. Gerson tried to refuse and got a slap round the head from Pearce, who was in no mood to accept a refusal. Rufus Dommett, his hair dark red from spray, his face gaunt from 4 days of being sick, needed O'Hagan to hold his head to obey. And in truth, by the time they got to him, the soup was getting cold and had within it a goodly dose of salt water. It was only when they had finished that both the providers realized that they had left nothing for themselves. "Mr. Digby," shouted Barclay from beside the wheel, "would you oblige me with some notion of what you are about? I am informed that you are feeding the hands on deck." "So that they will fight better, sir," Digby shouted back. Then, in a quieter voice, "Get rid of those kids, damn you." "British sailors, Mr. Digby," replied Barclay as the small wooden buckets disappeared over the side. "We'll fight on an empty belly if needs must." "Aye, aye, sir." Finally accepting that the yards on the course and topsails could be hauled round no more, Barclay ordered them to be sheeted home. As the falls were securely lashed off to a belaying pin, the men who had been hauling on them relaxed, some just to lean, others to collapse. But that was until a quiet word from their divisional officer reminded them that they must stand up, especially here, close to the quarterdeck, within plain view of the captain. If Pearce had learnt anything this last awful week, it was the division that the mainmast provided. Astern of that great round timber, the height of 2 men in diameter, was the preserve of the officers, termed the quarterdeck for no reason that he could discern. He was allowed to cross the divide to carry out any task allotted, scrubbing the decks, hauling on the falls, but he was not permitted to linger or address anyone unbidden, and that was a stricture that applied to the whole crew of seamen regardless of their rating. No social division pointed out to him on land by his father, and there had been plenty, had ever been so clearly defined. It was like an invisible wall that separated officers from men. Those who held, or, like midshipmen, anticipated commissions from those whose task it was to carry out whatever orders such people dealt out. Whether they made sense or not, were issued with kindness or malice, the most depressing aspect about the system was the way the men on the ship accepted this divide and respected it. Sovereign of the quarterdeck was the captain. That was where he was deferred to most, his rank acknowledged in endless lifting of hats, barks of "Aye, aye, sir," and obsequious looks meant to convey to him just what a puissant personage he was. Each time he thought on it, or witnessed the sight of what to him appeared mere grovelling, Pearce felt himself sickened. Ralph Barclay, unaware of the stare of malevolence aimed in his direction, was running a mass of facts through his mind. The accumulation of his own years at sea, and the teachings of those who had preceded him. Was the wind easing, and with it the swell? The sky was certainly clearing, the heavy cloud cover lifting. How was Brilliant handling? Had her holds been stowed right? Were her masts taking the strain or labouring? How much sail could she carry on this heading, into the wind but 20 points free, on a course that he hoped would put him between the Frenchman and his home shore? "T'gallants, Mr. Roscoe." "Aye, aye, sir." Half an hour later, Ralph Barclay was wondering if he should clear for action, knocking out the bulkheads and striking below everything not required. But that was a disruption to the ship that was best avoided.
Against that, it was an exercise the crew had not yet had time to practice, so it was likely to be a slow and laborious affair if he had to order it done. And what would happen if they saw action? With the lack of time and foul weather, he had not been able to get in some exercise on the great guns, or even a bit of practice with small arms. With all these worries to contend with, there was some satisfaction to be gained from the knowledge that the crew, despite failing to act as the unit it would one day become, would already have carried out certain tasks. Mess tables would have been lashed off to the deck beams, all extraneous articles secured, and the gun crews, even if the order had not come, would be close to their weapons. Behind him the marines were lined up on the poop, muskets at the ready, prepared to act wherever he sent them, and the topgallants were being rigged, if not at pace, with efficiency.
"Deck there! Chase in sight!" "Mr. Roscoe, orders to the gunner. Please ensure that we have enough cartridges for a prolonged action, and send someone to alert my steward to get the cabin furniture below. I require that my wife be moved also to a place of safety."
"Aye, aye, sir," Roscoe replied, managing, even with only half a face, to look exasperated.
"And since the hands have had no breakfast, I suggest that the master-at-arms be sent to the purser to request an extra ration of grog to keep their spirits up."
Information was shared with the whole ship as each new fact was called down to the deck. The Chase was a two-masted bark of 7 guns a side, flush-decked and wearing a tricolor at the main, facts which made sense to most of the crew, but remained a mystery to the pressed men of the afterguard. The fact that she was likely to be nippy in stays meant even less to the Pelicans than the speculation that she would be fast on a bowline. But that she would be a right fine prize, and sure to be bought in if taken, was enough to raise the spirits of Gerson, who understood quicker than the others that every member of the crew had a money share in any reward for capture.
"Mr. Digby," called Barclay, "I require you to cast off a pair of the quarterdeck guns and teach some of these new fellows how to handle them. We cannot go into a fight short of men to man our armaments."
"Will the main deck guns not suffice, sir?" To Digby that made perfect sense. The ship they might fight, being only a flush-decked bark and lightly armed, could not match the calibre of Brilliant's main armament. To man every gun, especially in this sea, was gilding the lily.
"It was customary," Barclay replied with deep irony, "in the navy in which I was raised, for lieutenants to obey an order from their captain."
"Sir." What Barclay was asking for was plain daft. To teach totally inexperienced men how to handle an 18-pounder cannon required a calm sea, a flat deck, and time. A pitching deck was more dangerous to the trainee gunners than the gun could ever be to the enemy.
"I would request the aid of 2 experienced gun captains, sir. Mr. Burns, double below and ask Mr. Thrale for the loan of 2 of his best gunners."
"And we require flintlocks," Digby added, responding to Barclay's raised eyebrow with, "For verisimilitude, sir." As Burns disappeared, Digby was tallying off 2 groups of 6 men, while admonishing the rest to listen and observe. Then he tapped the black-painted barrel of a cannon bowsed tight up against a gun-port.
"Be warned, this is near 2 tons of metal and wood with a mind of its own. There are lines to control her, and you must never let go of them. Once she is cast loose, those on the breechings and levers have to act together, for if you do not, a man could lose his leg, if not his life."
Then he picked up a ball from one of the rope garlands that kept it from rolling around the canting deck.
"This ball is 18 pounds in weight, hence the gun is an 18-pounder. From what we know of our quarry, she will be light in her scantlings, that is, her side timbers, so any well-aimed shot will go through and make mincemeat of any flesh it finds on deck. This is not the case with a ship of our own size or greater, so when aiming, the gun captain will lever the muzzle of the weapon up with that quoin under the barrel and fire into the rigging, hoping to hit a mast or dislodge a yard."
Whether what he was telling the 2 crews detailed to man the pair of guns was making sense was hard for Digby to know. The blank, wet faces that greeted his instructions seemed indifferent or too tired to take it in. After flintlocks had been fitted by a gunner's mate, he was glad to see 2 experienced gun captains arrive, for he had no desire to be too close himself the first time these men tried to control that weight. It was obvious from the faces of the 2 newcomers that they shared his opinion of the exercise. They both looked as though someone had pinched their extra grog. Assigned to a gun, Michael O'Hagan and Charlie Taverner were allotted to the ropes on one side that ran through blocks, lashed to the bulwarks, while Rufus Dommett and John Pearce took those on the other. Being compact and looking nimble, Ben Walker was given the swab, while a volunteer landsman whose name they did not know was allotted the rammer. Digby sent for 2 buckets of water, and these were placed between the guns. One, he explained, for the swabber to wash the sheepskin head on his pole. The other had a ladle out of which the men could drink, for manning a gun was damned warm work. "First, you must cast off the breechings." This they did, and the cannon rolled back on the swell, Digby shouting at the rope men to hold her steady and ease her back until the lines were taut. While the gun port was opened, the 2 front men, O'Hagan and Pearce, were ordered to take up the levers and jam them under the front wheels of the carriage. The reason was obvious. As the angle of the deck altered, the levers acted as brakes. This allowed the gun captain to bring forward the cartridge and the wad, and behind him Ben Walker had the black-painted balls, none of which, since this was all to be in dumb show, were actually placed in the barrel. Digby had both swab and rammer employed, as though the gun had been fired. Then, on the gun captain's command, all 6 men hauled on the breechings to pull the weapon up to its firing position, which put the muzzle well beyond the side of the ship. Still in pretence, the gun captain pulled the flintlock and created the spark that, in real life, would fire the powder pricked into the touch-hole, which in turn would explode the cartridge rammed into the barrel, sending the ball towards its target. "Now, this, lads, is when a gun is at its most dangerous, for when it fires it shoots back damned quick on what we call the recoil, and is out of control, with some of the wheels jumping the deck. So the men with the levers must be ready to get them under those wheels, for if they do not, the gun will roll forward again and crush the men waiting to swab, load and ram." Digby smiled. For all his misgivings, the first attempt on both guns had gone smoothly. "Now let us try the whole procedure again." In the great cabin, Emily Barclay was aware and grateful for the fact that the weather seemed to be improving, for she had had an uncomfortable time. Her husband's predictions of days without proper hot food or comfort had been truly borne out, and she had learnt that in stormy weather the simplest task went from molehill to mountain. Merely to move from one side of the cabin to another required forethought and calculation, not least to time the movement to avoid the large amount of filthy seawater swilling about on the floor. Even sitting down it was impossible to do anything. Sewing was a series of endless skin punctures leading to abandonment. Reading by salt-streaked cabin windows or by a constantly swaying lantern, with one hand fixed to some object for security, feet raised to keep them dry, was unedifying in the extreme. Husband Ralph, when he wasn't on deck, showed her great concern, obviously worried that she might be seasick, equally showing pride that she did not succumb. Worst was the fact that because of the weather and the amount of work needed to keep the ship operable, the deck was barred to her, which meant no fresh air. Indeed, the cabin had become rank from closed casements and constant human occupation, a situation not aided by the leavings of the hen coop being washed astern. The only place of comfort was their matrimonial cot, slung so that while the ship moved it remained still, with the caveat that a moving room was like to make her stomach churn, even though all it contained was ship's biscuit and soup. And now, not only had the ship's motion eased, there was the prospect of action. There had been alarm and commotion, a change of course, the beating of a drum instead of the wail of pipes. A French privateer had been sighted, and she was stuck in this place. "Shenton!" The steward took his time in replying, hanging on to the jamb of the door, exaggerating, Emily thought, the difficulty of keeping his balance. "Are we about to have a battle?" "We might, but it'll be a right while yet." "My cloak, and please take a request to my husband." Vaguely aware of the training going on to windward, Ralph Barclay was thinking that his ship was not sailing at anything like her best. Looking at the sail plan, he had the notion that there was too great a press aloft on the main and mizzen, and that the weight of the wind on that excess canvas was forcing the ship's leeward head into the water. "Sir," said Barclay's steward, who had come up to whisper in his ear, "your wife wonders if she might be allowed to come on deck, since she had been informed that there is as yet no danger." Barclay nodded, for Emily was right. At the present rate of sailing it would be an hour before they could engage, and that would only be if the Frenchman held his course. "Which he will not do, my dear," Barclay explained, "for he would be a fool to engage a frigate." "Yet you tell me he sails on," Emily asked. "Has he not turned to run from us?" "To see what mischief he can create, my dear. I have told Gould to hold his position, to draw him on." He led her over to the mizzen ratlins on the windward side. "Now, if you take station here and use a rope to steady yourself, you will be able to observe all that happens and—" the smile was paternal, indulgent, "not be in the way." Then he called to no one in particular, "A piece of tow for Mrs. Barclay's hand. I would not wish my wife's palm to be covered in tar." "Aye, aye, sir," came the response, as every midshipman rushed to obey. "Mr. Collins," he called to the master as he resumed his position by the wheel, half aware that he was showing off to Emily and enjoying the fact that he was doing so. "I require that a reef be let out on the forecourse and that the main course be goose-winged to allow the wind some play on it." Collins had a remarkably vacuous countenance at the best of times, all puffed cheeks and sloth eyes, and hesitation did nothing to aid his appearance. It seemed an age before he responded and gave the orders that Barclay suggested. The topmen, too slow for the captain's liking, let out the forecourse one reef. Meanwhile those on the mainmast lifted one corner of the main course to windward, so it no longer blocked the wind from the sail in front. The effect was immediate and satisfying. The way on the ship smoothed, and Barclay was certain they had achieved a discernible increase in speed. "Aloft there!" Barclay called. "Does the Frenchman show any sign of changing course?" "No, sir." "Mr. Collins, return the sails to their previous configuration. But I want the men standing by to reverse the procedure again, but this time with some alacrity." He continued in a voice loud enough to ensure that his wife heard, saying words that, had she not been present, he would have kept to himself. "Let the fellow come on, judging our speed by what he has already seen. Then we shall give him a fright." Half an hour went by with the pressed men of the afterguard toiling away at the cannon, till they had got the action smooth enough to satisfy Lieutenant Digby. Once that had been achieved, and he had discerned that Captain Barclay's attention lay elsewhere, he had them secure the weapon, then sent them off the quarter-deck to await orders on the leeward gangway. The volunteer who had worked with them on their gun moved away to join his own mates, clearly not wishing to associate with pressed men. "God, my hands," said Gerson, looking at his red and raw palms, his young face creased with torment. "Is there nothing aboard a ship that does not require a rope?" "You're just soft, Corny," said O'Hagan. "Don't call me by that name." "I can think of one or two others you deserve," hooted Charlie. That produced the pout with which they were all familiar. Gerson was outside the group. It was in his face and the way he held his body, and it was also plain that he liked it that way, below decks happier in the company of sailors than mess number 12. It was Pearce who gave of the opinion that they were all soft because he, in his life, had been no more of a worker than bumptious Cornelius Gerson. Reading books, practising rhetoric, expounding philosophical texts, intermingled with occasional practice with an épée and sometimes riding a horse, was scant grounding for this. As for the others, the life of the liberties, the odd job loading and unloading boats had not prepared them for such endless, heavy toil. "You feeling any better, Rufus?" he asked quietly. Although he nodded, it was hard for Rufus Dommett, with his pale, freckled skin, to look anything but unhealthy. But the underlying pallor brought on by seasickness seemed to have finally abated, and since the breeze had eased and the new course of the frigate had put her less at the mercy of the cross-sea, he was in a fair way to be wind-dried as well. Looking at his messmates, Pearce felt a tinge of amiability, for they had ceased to be strangers. Friends, no, though he would be happy to afford that title to Michael O'Hagan. But Gerson aside, they had begun to act collectively, a melding created by Martin Dent that had carried over into their everyday existence. He also thought that, though they looked rough, they also looked better than they had for days. "Who was that fool that suggested we linger in the Pelican?" murmured Charlie Taverner.
"Why, I recall,"
crowed Ben Walker, producing a bitter free laugh for the first time in days,
"that it was you wagering that you could get a drink out of John Pearce here."
"And did I not get it?" Charlie insisted. Then, smiling at Pearce, he added, "You was easy, mate, John." Pearce, who suspected Charlie might be right, smiled back. But he also signalled that they should keep their voices down. Even if Kemp was no longer shadowing them, there were more like him aboard who would take as much pleasure as he did in checking them. "So it's your fault," said Rufus softly, looking at Pearce with a wan grin to cover his temerity, in not only having such a thought but expressing it. "Odd," Charlie added. "When you came in I said to Abel you was hunted-looking. You were running, John, were you not? Though you've yet to confide what from." "Does it matter now?" Pearce replied, glancing at O'Hagan, who responded by looking skywards. "I don't recall Ben there telling why he was taking refuge in the Savoy." "That I'll keep close yet, if you don't mind," Walker whispered. But Pearce's words clearly reminded him of the cause, for a look of pain crossed his features.
"With Jesus, it matters not to me," said O'Hagan, scowling, "for either of you. We're here now, and all that is past is past. What we got to do is find a way to make this life more easy."
"What about getting free?" demanded Gerson querulously. Charlie Taverner answered that with a jeer. "Such a thing, Corny, needs dry land, and I doubt you or any of your chancy mates could see any of that even from the tops." Pearce looked at his messmates again, but this time with a sense of objectivity. If he was stuck aboard this ship, he was also stuck with them. Who he liked and disliked made no odds. Michael had his Irish ways. Charlie Taverner, who looked more weak and foolish now than the rascal he had first thought him to be. At least he could always be counted on to conjure up a jest, and that was something. Rufus had quite gone off the notion of life as a seaman, unlike Ben Walker. He had suffered as much as anyone, but managed to bear up as soon as a chance to relax had been gifted to him. Gerson was pouting because of the way Charlie had put him down as a pest. By Christ, he was a handsome one. The general opinion, voiced when he wasn't around, was that he was deep in some kind of ordure, and it was no wonder to all that his bumptious nature had got him into trouble. Freedom? Easy to talk about, damned hard to find in this service and this place. He pointed out to the others how the malignance of the crew, especially after Michael's bout with Devereux, was already easing into acceptance, and if there were a way of escape, then these men bred to the sea would know of it. The smug look on Gerson's face stopped him from going further on that tack. "Until then," Pearce hissed, "we are stuck on this damn ship for as long as it takes to get a sight of land and a chance to get ourselves ashore. And I say being useless will not aid that. We should look, listen, and learn, which is what I shall do." Looking back at the quarterdeck, he observed Barclay swaying easily with the motion of the ship, hands behind his back like a caricature. Pearce had listened to him giving orders and had found himself interested in both the way they were issued and the result. Was Barclay a competent sailor and a doughty fighter? The fact that he wanted him to be neither, wanted him to be a coward he could despise, would not make the man so, any more than wishing he were ashore would put him on dry land. "What I'm saying is that I agree with Michael here," Pearce added, ignoring the frown on Charlie Taverner's face. "We have to make a fist of what we've got, for as sure as the devil resides in hell, if we don't, we will go under." "Don't say that," moaned Cornelius Gerson.
"Mr. Roscoe," said Ralph Barclay, loudly enough to be heard all along the deck, "I think we may clear for action."
End of CD 8. CD 9.
Number 12 mess was set to work again as labourers, watching as more experienced men knocked out the wedges that held the bulkhead walls of the wardroom in place, before being detailed to take away the small individual panels and the frame that held the door. Going below, they were joined by those carrying the interior walls to the captain's cabin, and followed by others bearing furniture, wine cooler, leaved dining table, chairs and chests, a mirror glass wrapped in canvas, the double cot, brass wall lamps that lit the cabins, all carefully stacked by a petty officer in a way that protected each object from damage. They returned to a main deck already sanded so that bare feet would not slip, bare from stem to stern, and with the guns run out through open ports. The men who had been with them moved swiftly to their allotted positions, while a harrying voice to the rear ordered them aloft, back to the weapon on which they had been practising, to a deck and sea view in which not much seemed to have changed. Captain Ralph Barclay was still standing swaying amidships, hand clasped behind him, surrounded by his fawning officers and midshipmen. Mrs. Barclay was still by the weather ratlins, looking in the same direction as everyone else, towards the French bark that was still holding the same course. The number of marines on the poop had thinned, and, looking around and up, Pearce saw that some of them had clambered up to the main and foremast caps. Kemp had moved close again, and was glaring at any pressed man or volunteer landsman who caught his eye.
"Mr. Digby!"
The shout made Pearce look round, only to see that the puce-faced captain was pointing right at him. Although alarmed, Pearce registered that the captain's wife had turned also to follow that accusing finger, and he could not but help look at her face, pink from the crisp air, eyes staring at him with what he thought was curiosity, as though she was truly wondering, as he was himself, how he had got there.
"Start that man! He is not here to stare over the rail, he is here to work the guns!"
"Sir," Digby responded, before insisting quietly, "Move, man, before you earn the rattan." Kemp managed to get round Digby and give Pearce a swipe, followed by a defiant look at the lieutenant and another at Pearce that was virtually an invitation to retaliate. He had to fight the temptation to oblige.
"I will not have passengers, Mr. Digby,"
Barclay added, a comment that endorsed the action of the snivelling boatswain's mate and cut off whatever it was Digby had intended to say to him. Mess number 12 were round the gun again, and although it had only been a half-hour since they had been practising, it was clear that most of the party, with tired minds as well as exhausted bodies, had forgotten where to stand. Pearce, his back still smarting from the blow Kemp had given him, and aware that he was close enough to administer more, ordered his messmates into place as he overheard Lieutenant Digby, in a stiff voice, acknowledge the captain's words. "Michael with me on this side. Rufus, you and Corney on the other." Ben Walker, seeing where the others were going, realised his own station and picked up the swab, and the volunteer who had joined them, though he had yet to exchange a word with them, took up the rammer. A young boy of about 10 years presented himself, carrying half a dozen square cloth bundles roughly sewn, and looked around the faces, clearly seeking someone to whom they should be given. "Cartridges!" he piped, only to be greeted by a sea of uninterested faces. "Which one of you buggers is the gun captain?" "Sure that is the one thing missing, John boy," said O'Hagan, nudging Pearce. "Happen you should take that on, Pearce," added Gerson in an arch voice. "You seem comfortable giving out orders." "Someone's got to take them," said the boy. "I'd get my arse whipped if I ain't back at the gunner's window in half a shake."
"Mr. Hale!"
barked Digby, realising the dilemma, and calling to the coxswain who had just come onto the quarterdeck armed and bearing his captain's sword and pistols.
Double to the main deck. Get me 2 gunners standing by, experienced enough to act as captains. We won't get the real thing this time. I want them on deck as soon as we engage."
"You're asking for the moon on this, Barky," Hale griped, his objection clearly more to being given the task in the first place than the requirement it placed upon him.
"There's hardly a soul aboard who knows stem from stern." "You, boy," Digby added, "lay those cartridges along the back of the shot garland. The rest of you, for the sake of the Lord, do not cast off until you are ordered to do so. This is your station, but because we are short of hands there will be other tasks to perform. Go to those tasks, then return here when they are complete, and don't, at your peril, stare at the captain. Keep your eyes firmly the other way, and no slouching." "Mr. Collins," said Barclay, just as Digby finished, "I believe it is nearly time to show our Frenchman the nature of his mistake."
"Sir?"
So close, Pearce could see in the way that Collins responded that he posed very much a question, instead of what Barclay clearly expected, which was an acknowledgment.
"Damn you, man!" the captain hissed.
Ralph Barclay's blood was up, and even if he was happy that it was so, he had no time to indulge the idiots with whom he had been saddled. Right now he would have given his eye teeth for the men who had sailed with him on his last commission, officers and a master who knew his ways and anticipated his orders, who trusted him and never ever returned him a questioning look when given a command.
"Stand by to adjust the sails as we did before, sir. Are you not aware that at any moment now that Frenchman is going to luff up and run? Do you know nothing, sir, or guess less?"
Chapter 12. Not one of the Tyro gun crew, Pearce least of all, was obeying the last injunction of Lieutenant Digby to look away. All were intent on watching what was happening on the quarter-deck. There, the 2 men on the wheel were stony-faced and staring straight ahead. The flustered master, face creased with worry, was trying to compose in his mind the order of words he would need to obey the captain. Fairmelow, the lanky midshipman, fiddled with the leaves of a thick oilskin-covered book. Plump little Burns in his oversized coat stood by, and Lieutenant Roscoe, the fallen side of his face hidden from them, glared at his captain's back as Barclay moved over to talk to his wife.
"You must go below now, my dear. The deck will be no place for you once the balls begin to fly."
"Will there be wounded, Captain Barclay?" Emily asked, glancing to where Lutyens had taken station. Her husband's eyes followed hers.
"Mr. Lutyens," he called, "I suggest you would be better placed below decks. That is where your duty requires you to be."
A rather abashed surgeon obeyed, as Ralph Barclay turned back to say quietly to his wife,
"It is very possible. Nothing is certain in a fight at sea, though I hope the injured are French dogs rather than any of my own men."
"Then, with your permission, I will go to Mr. Lutyens and offer my services." Barclay had to think about that. Was it proper for his wife to help there? She had never seen a cockpit after a sea fight. Was she up to the amount of blood and gore that could be generated? The lopping off of limbs from frightened men, their screaming mingled with that of the wounded awaiting their fate at the hands of a man who could be more butcher than surgeon. Lutyens with the knife and saw was an unknown quantity.
"Do you have any idea, my dear, of what an unpleasant place that can be?"
"I cannot be useless, Captain Barclay, and I hope and pray that you would not want me to be." Barclay had to draw in his breath then, struck as he had been many times since their betrothal by the sheer beauty of Emily when she took on her features that look of determination. He wanted to refuse her request, partly in order to spare her, but more from a fear that, faced with the reality of a bloody cockpit, she might embarrass him by fleeing. But those green eyes fixed on him were death to any resolve, and he found himself nodding.
"But, my dear," Ralph Barclay added without conviction, "if you become distressed, you must leave immediately."
He got another direct look, and words that made him wonder if this young wife of his could read his mind. "I would not dare to do that, for it would disgrace your name, our name."
"Mr. Burns,"
Barclay called without turning, for he was still held by those eyes.
"My wife will not be going to the cable tier. I require you to escort Mrs. Barclay, once she has changed her clothing, To the cockpit."
Then he did turn to look around the ship, the expression on his face seeming to desire that all aboard should match that spirit. The triumphant ocular tour brought him right round to the gun and the staring faces of mess number 12.
"Mr. Roscoe, are you aware of those men, and what are they about?"
Roscoe, who had been looking in the direction of the chase, was startled, and his body seemed to jerk as he threw himself towards them, snarling in what was an excessive reaction.
"I have you marked, you bloody swine, and I'll see you damned." "Language, sir," Barclay admonished him. "My wife is still in earshot." "Mr. Fairmelow, take the names of these men," Roscoe added. "I have your name, sir," Barclay continued, glaring at Roscoe, who was forced to turn and face him. The man had been daydreaming, which at a time like this was unforgivable. "I have it in my head, and by God I shall soon enter it in the log, and I assure you it will not be as a paean to your competence."
"Now there, by Jesus," whispered Michael O'Hagan, his body halfway across the gun, his heavily bruised face bemused, "is a man prone to the making of enemies." "Silence there!" said Midshipman Fairmelow, who had come to take their names. "All hands to change sail!" the master yelled. For the first time since being dragged aboard, 12 mess shot to the place where they were required without either orders or the use of a rattan, leaving the lanky mid looking very foolish. Sore hands or not, they stood ready to haul on the ropes that controlled the great mainsail. A line appeared out of the sky, as it had done on the previous occasion, but this time, without being ordered to do so, Rufus Dommett caught it and hauled it to the belaying pin that held the corner of the sail taut, while Ben Walker, again unbidden, began to undo the binding. The other members of the mess took hold of the rope attached to the corner of the sail to hold it so that it would not fly off on the wind and leave the sail flapping uselessly. Someone, somewhere, showed a degree of competence, perhaps the master, for 2 experienced sailors arrived to tie the knot that would splice the 2 ropes together, then to supervise the way it was paid out so that the corner of the main course could be raised to form a triangle, with the apex lashed to the yard very close to the mainmast, all the time without once allowing the pressure of the wind to carry it away. "Bugger me, mate," said one of the experienced hands with a look of surprise. "Happen you're learning." "What's that called?" asked Pearce. "That manoeuvre?"
"It'd be called a goose swing," said one of the sailors. "Captain reckons the forecourse will draw better that way, 'cause by lifting the corner of the mainsail, the wind can get at it."
"Thank you, friend," replied Pearce. "Much obliged." They were moving away, back to wherever they had come from, when one sailor said to the other,
"Much obliged. Happen there's something to be said for having a gent aboard, Smithy."
"Well, we're short of the commodity on the quarterdeck, mate," the other replied, "and that's no error." "Do we go back to the gun now?" asked Charlie Taverner. The question was addressed to Pearce, underlining how he, without wishing for or seeking it, and with Gerson objecting, was being deferred to. His affirmative nod had them all moving. "Look out for that midshipman that was set to take our names," hissed Rufus. "That sailor was right," said Pearce. "We are learning." It was a silent group that shuffled back to the gun, and when they got there they kept their eyes firmly away from the knot of officers on the quarterdeck, though they could hear clearly enough whatever was being said.
"There you go, sir," called Digby. "He has let fly and ported his helm."
Barclay responded boastfully,
"But we have stolen half a cable's length on the son of a bitch."
Lieutenant Roscoe snorted with what could only be termed derision.
"Hardly that, sir."
Pearce had to sneak a look, guessing that if he had deliberately set out to rile his commanding officer, Roscoe could not have chosen a better way. He saw Barclay swell up.
"I take leave to surmise you would not have done anything. I admonish you to learn from this, sir, for it is to the pity of the Navy that you may one day command your own vessel."
"Sir, you cannot address me so," Roscoe protested. Barclay's reply was icy.
"Sir, I am the captain of this ship. I can address you howsoever I like."
"That, sir," Roscoe responded, "will, I think, be decided by those in higher authority
when I demand a court-martial." "Demand away, sir. I look forward to a public exposure of your conduct. Now you will oblige me by being silent. We have, in case you have forgotten, an enemy to fight." "On deck there! Firefly signalling!"
Fairmeadow was glad to be back in his signal book. He was able to see clearly the flags, and was no longer obliged to stare straight ahead and listen to the bitter, embarrassing exchanges of his captain and first lieutenant. "Captain Gould is asking again for permission to pursue the chase, sir." Pearce saw Ralph Barclay lose his temper completely then, yelling in a voice that could be heard all over the deck.
"Am I to be plagued? Is there an officer in the service that understands an order when it is given?"
His voice dropped, but not much.
"Mr. Fairmeadow, repeat the signal to Firefly to hold his position."
"I feel I must speak, sir," said Roscoe. "My duty demands it."
"What?"
"Captain Gould is surely a match for the chase."
"So?"
"It flies in the face of all reason not to let Firefly pursue, and I can only assume that another reason, not a tactical one, intrudes on your thinking."
"Mr. Roscoe—"
"Please, sir," Roscoe interrupted, "make sure that those remarks are noted in the log along with anything you may choose to enter."
"I will note that you have undertaken to exceed your position. Now oblige me by remembering your rank."
Ralph Barclay had to turn away then, because his premier had stung him into examining what he was doing, and Roscoe had the right of it. Davidge Gould did command a vessel that could sail closer to the wind, and his sloop was well enough armed to fight the Frenchman. But Gould did not need what he needed, which was something that could be set against his name to elevate it. Gould had influence, and a seeming rapport with those in authority. The captain of HMS Brilliant enjoyed none of these advantages. Indeed, he was sure in his own mind that amongst those who mattered at the Admiralty there was a conspiracy to do him down.
"I will respond to you, Mr. Roscoe, so that when we meet in court, in front of officers who comprehend the matter more clearly, the thing is clear. I agree that Firefly is a match for our Frenchman, but she is no more than that. Thus, in an engagement, when nothing is certain, she may suffer either in casualties or shipboard damage. That is something which, as joint escorts, who are not yet clear of the Channel, we can ill afford. Who knows what force we might meet at this, the beginning of a war? And, sir, I would remind you that we are bound for the Mediterranean, and it is incumbent upon us to arrive whole and of some use. We, on the other hand, risk nothing against such an enemy. If we cannot catch him, we will at least drive him off."
Roscoe snorted again. Pearce reckoned he could not say the captain was a liar, not openly anyway, but wished to make it clear that he thought him so. "I cannot comprehend this," said Pearce softly to his mates. He was wondering how, and these men had a ship to command and a possible battle to fight, in which the sailors under their command could be wounded or die, they could indulge themselves in a personal quarrel.
"It's simple, Pearce," said Ben Walker, in his measured West Country drawl. "They are both bastards, but one is a bigger bastard than the other."
The Frenchman could not have been unaware of the approach of HMS Brilliant, because, quite apart from her course, the signal gun was in almost constant use to alert merchant captains to get out of the way. Barclay was crowding on sail, topgallants and fore and outer jib, and ploughing through the water looked set to ram any sod that got in his way. Not everyone reacted with the required speed, and the frigate captain showed his impatience by putting a round shot over the bows of one merchant ship that was a tad laggardly and backing its top hamper to let him through. The captain of the French bark had done what Barclay had supposed he would, put up his helm and headed for his home shore over the eastern horizon. Barclay's intention was to cut an angle that would bring the fellow to battle before he could get clear. It would be touch and go, he could see that, but he was slightly strung in the amount of canvas he could bear aloft. The overnight gale had abated somewhat, but he still had to contend with a blustery west wind that was far from constant, so that what appeared a sound sail plan 1 minute looked excessive the next, as the frigate heeled over in a gust and the lee rail came close to the water. "Holy Mother of Christ," groaned Michael O'Hagan, as the pea-green sea, flecked with foam, rose up to meet him. The others, particularly Gerson, could not look. Pearce was far from sanguine, though he had seen the Dover to Calais packet in the same state, and recalled that, alarmed as he had certainly been, the vessel had always righted itself. Just as Berkeley was about to ease something to take the pressure off his sails, the wind would decrease, leaving him with the conundrum of knowing that very likely he would face the same dilemma in a few moments. The chase was not idle. Sailing large, with the wind coming in over her stern, the enemy ship had also crowded on canvas to escape. Berkeley realized that with such a wind on such a bearing, the bark could trend away southwards whenever she liked, increasing the distance at which he would cross the T of her course.
"Mr. Collins, I require a little more southing," said Berkeley.
"Then we must take in some sail, sir, or ease the braces. With the yards so far round, the wind will be coming in over our beam."
"Let us see how she fares. She is a good sea-boat, I think, and will serve us well."
It was a gamble, because Berkeley was risking carrying away something major. Brilliant would not be thrown on her beam ends, but one of his tightly lodged and stiff masts might go by the board with so much pressure on them.
"Mr. Roscoe, a party standing by to ease the wedges on the mainmast."
"Chase is altering course to the south, sir," said Collins. Even given the time it was taking to close, there was added tension on the ship. Pearce had the feeling that not everyone was happy. Collins, from what he could see, was incapable of the emotion, and Roscoe was miserable, convinced that what his captain was about was wrong. But it was the crew that interested him most, or those he could see. All were looking forward 1 minute, then at a mast when it, and the rigging that held it, groaned with the strain. It looked to be a strange combination of exhilaration and fear.
"A bow chaser, Mr. Roscoe,"
Berkeley ordered, never once taking his eye off the prize.
"Only the windward port can be opened with any safety, I think. Get it manned and run out, if you please. Let's try the range as soon as it's loaded."
Burns was sent with the message, and the bow chaser was fired within minutes, sending a great spiral of black smoke billowing out and across the front of the ship before it was carried away on the wind. Craning, Pearce tried to see the fall of the shot, but at the height of the deck, and in a choppy sea, that was impossible. The information came from the masthead, where they could see.
"A whole cable length shy of the target, Your Honour." "Very well," said Berkeley. If he was disappointed, it did not show. Every 10 minutes the guns fired, it being noted that although the range was closing, it was not yet true. Ralph Berkeley knew that he could have the fellow, because at some time soon, when they were in range, he could change course to bring more guns to bear. "Chase has altered course again, Your Honour,"
called the lookout. "Heading due west by my reckoning," said Collins.
"The man's a fool," hooted Berkeley, "though I cannot say his stupidity displeases me."
"He's bending on more sail, stunsails and kites by the look of it." Moving forward, Ralph Berkeley raised his telescope to his eye, and an enemy ship that was in plain view anyway swam into focus. He could see the crew on the deck, numerous as befitted a privateer vessel, as they struggled to get aloft a mass of canvas. It was 10 minutes before they succeeded, during which Ralph Berkeley felt he was holding his breath, for what his adversary was about made little sense. With a frigate on his quarter, he should have kept his previous course, maintaining as much distance as he could so that when the gap between the two ships closed, Brilliant would still be at maximum range. By his present actions, he was exposing himself to a broadside at a distance where it could do serious damage in the very first salvo, damage that would make escape impossible. Being disabused of the notions he was considering was a moment of deep discomfort for Ralph Berkeley. Almost as soon as the Frenchman had sheeted home his extra sails, the bark leapt forward. Fresh from port, she had a clean bottom, and her lines were such that she had always looked swift. Now she showed just how good she was, leaving the captain of HMS Brilliant in no doubt that if he did not react, he would be lucky if she ever came in range.
"Alter course to the south, Mr. Collins."
"Sir," said the master, "we are carrying too much canvas."
"Get those wedges knocked out on the mainmast now," growled Barclay. "And, Mr. Collins, do as I bid."
Then he shouted in a stentorian voice,
"Bow chaser, maximum elevation! Try the range again!"
As Brilliant turned, the wind took her over until the boom end of her main-course yard was nearly in the water. Everywhere on the steeply canted deck people were hanging on for dear life. But that did not last long, for the forecourse ripped right across its length from the pressure of the wind, and the decrease in force began to right the ship. But without that sail, the pressure on the rest would increase, and it was only a matter of time before a mast went by the board or another stretch of canvas ripped itself asunder.
"Mr. Collins, ease the braces, then bring me round onto a parallel course to the chase. Mr. Roscoe, a new forecourse from the sail locker immediately, and all hands to bend it on."
The command to ease echoed down the ship, one loop being taken off the belaying pins by men who knew they had to leave the second one be to keep a grip on the falls. The great sails began to flap, cracking like angry gods as they lost the pressure of the wind. As the rudder was hauled round and the bows trended eastwards, on one side of the deck they were pulling hard, while on the other, mess number 12 was easing out the ropes, while maintaining control with a single loop. Ralph Barclay was pleased by the way the manoeuvre was carried out, because his ship never lost steerage way, and once the head was round, the command to sheet home was given and the yards were tied off.
"Jesus," said Michael, "did we do that right or what?"
"Nobody cursed us," said Ben Walker, "and that has to be a first."
"Now, Mr. Roscoe,"
said Barclay with grim determination,
"we will see what our ship can do."
"Firefly signalling again, sir," called Fairmeadow. "Do you require assistance?"
"Negative."
Ralph Barclay's mind was teeming. He was on a course now that would suit his ship, with the wind coming in over his starboard quarter, probably her best point of sailing. He could get aloft as much sail as his ship could bear, but he would not discern for an age if he had the legs of the chase, although he knew she was a bit of a flyer. Against that he had a standing order to stay in sight of the convoy.
"A signal to Captain Gould, Mr. Fairmeadow, to take station to the east of our charges."
Firefly's masthead would be the convoy as far as he was concerned, and he hoped that Gould would smoke his intention and put himself as far eastwards as he dare. This would allow him to extend the range to which he could chase a quarry running before him.
"Now, Mr. Collins, I require to be shown what my ship will bear aloft."
By the time the men had been released to have their dinner, Ralph Barclay knew that with the wind now steady in the west, blowing stiff but not hard, he could catch the Frenchman. But what was worrying, as the afternoon wore on, was the season. There was not much daylight left. It was gratifying to observe that his crew was eager. Few stayed snug below for long, though it was cold on deck, for what they were after represented a cash bounty to every man aboard. His dinner had been a hurried affair, taken in full view of those on the main deck, for his cabin walls were still in the holds, and Emily, who had craved to do so, was allowed to join him on deck. There he pointed out to her the various sails he had aloft, nearly a full suit, rising through courses, topsails, topgallants, to kites. "While those, my dear, on the weather side, that being where the wind is coming from, are called studding sails. Look behind us, and you will see how the mizzen gaff is braced right round to take the wind, and for'ard we have everything twixt foremast and jib boom she will carry, sprit sails included. We are at present maintaining a steady 9 knots. Pearce, back at his station on the larboard side where the gangway joined the quarterdeck, watched Barclay as he patiently explained matters to his wife. The wind, still strong but now of a more even temper, coming over the other side of the stern, carried the captain's words to him, not all distinct, but enough for him to follow what the captain was alluding to. Pearce was impressed, as much by the rate of progress through the water as by the beauty of the huge quantity of taut sails. The ship they were pursuing, drawing gradually closer, but at an imperceptible rate, had a beauty of her own, showing a clean white wake astern. The air, now that the wind was not coming in over the bows, was not wet, but it had about it a tang of cleanliness the like of which he had rarely experienced. Hate his situation he might, but he felt it would be churlish not to take pleasure from what he could, though the prospect of what was coming to the Frenchman was not something he could be happy about.
"First,"
Dysart had told him and his fellows,
"we will give the bugger what for with the bow-chasers, maybe knock away a spar or two. Then we will range alongside, and if he doesn't strike his colours damn quick, we will give him what for of a broadside, aimed high, mind, so that the hull will no be damaged."
"Then?" asked Charlie Taverner.
"Well, if he's an idiot, we will board."
"Idiot," Pearce had translated, which earned him a raised eyebrow from Dysart, as if he was saying, "Maybe you're a Scot after all."
"But like as not he will strike, and then we can do a wee calculation and see how much everybody has made."
"Do you have any notion now?" asked Gerson, long lashes fluttering in a way that made Dysart frown.
2/8 of the whole is what we get."
"That is a quarter," Gerson added pedantically.
"Is that a fact?"
Dysart replied without much certainty. There was a general air of excitement, but that soon faded as reality intruded, despite the best efforts of Dysart to fabricate a better case. Pearce wondered, as the Scotsman explained, at a system of rewards so heavily weighted in favour of officers, up to 3/8 for the captain, 2 if he had to give one to an admiral, 1 for the superior officers, 1 for the warrants, 1 for the petty officers, and just 2 for the men who did the actual fighting, who, naturally being the largest numerical group, had a portion sliced exceedingly thin. It was the kind of arrangement against which his father had railed half his life. Those who had the most got the most, while the needy were given what would, when it was split up with so many, be a pittance. It was good to discern that the crew of the ship, as they discussed the matter, were as unimpressed as he, and they had made it plain that, while any payment was welcome, the way monies were split was a bone of contention throughout the entire fleet.
"Masthead,"
Barclay called,
"do you still have sight of HMS Firefly?"
"She's hull down now, Your Honour, but I can still see the main jackyard as she rises on the swell, and her pennant is plain regardless."
"Mr. Roscoe, what was the name of that missing East Indiaman, the one that hauled his wind last evening?"
"She was the Lady Harrington out of London, sir." Barclay stared right at Roscoe, then as if challenging him.
"Tell our lookouts to keep an eye out for her."
He got a stare back, then the beginnings of comprehension. Barclay could leave sight of the bulk of his convoy in only one instance, to look for and chivvy stragglers. That would be entered in the ship's log to cover the captain against chastisement.
"Mr. Roscoe," Barclay added, "I think we must try the bow-chasers again. Both cannon this time. The hour demands it."
Pearce had to stand aside as Ralph Barclay took his wife forward so that she could witness the firing of the guns from beneath her feet and, Barclay hoped, see the spouts of water created by the shot, though it was a forlorn hope that she would see a ball strike the chase. Emily Barclay smiled at Pearce. Here before her was the writer of the coded letter, and with that in her mind she said softly, "Pardonnez-moi." The object of the apology had returned her look until she spoke, grey eyes steady. Then he nodded his head and executed 1/20th of a bow to accept her greeting, wondering why she had spoken to him in French. Ralph Barclay was curious regarding 2 things: why his wife had addressed him at all, for he had only heard the sound, not the words, and what was this lowlife doing reacting like a gentleman in a fashionable salon.
"Mr. Digby," he called, "this fellow on the gangway does not know his manners. Please be so good as to show him how to salute a captain and his lady."
The face was close enough to see each broken vein. Pearce was thinking, "Don't respond," his fists clenched and his whole body as tight as a drum, that damned trembling afflicting him again. Fortunately, Barclay and his wife moved on, Burns in tow like a footman, as Lieutenant Digby came to obey his captain's instructions. "Officers, Pearce, lift their hats," Digby said gently. Then he made a loose fist and touched the knuckle to his forehead. "You salute in this manner." "And," Pearce responded, staring straight at the officer, his voice even and his body beginning to relax, "if I do not choose to make such a demeaning gesture?" "Not to do so is a punishable offence. So in order to avoid punishment I must show my knuckle to a man I despise." Digby tried very hard to look furious, his face succeeding while his voice failed. "I could have you at the grating for that." "Then you must do so, Lieutenant Digby, for nothing on this earth will get me to salute Captain Barclay." "Then stay out of his damned way and his eye-line." The booming cannon allowed Digby to turn away from a look he was at a loss to cope with. He knew it to be one of his failings as an officer, his inability to impose discipline by any other method than persuasion. Up till now, in the main, it had worked for him, but as he moved away from Pearce he had very serious doubts if it would work with the man who had just challenged him. Suddenly he spun round. "Be assured, Pearce, I will have you at the grating if need be. That I will take no pleasure in doing so will not stop me." Slowly, with just a trace of a smile on his face, Pearce raised a fist and knuckled his forehead. "Sir?" "I hope you believe me," Digby insisted, as a pair of cannon boomed out behind him. "I believe you would take no pleasure in it, sir."
"Short by the length of the chase, Your Honour."
There was no need for the masthead report. Ralph Barclay had seen how short the balls had fallen, and if his wife was excited by the waterspouts that shot 50 feet in the air, for it took no great genius to calculate that the rate that they were overhauling the chase would mean that he would sail not only into darkness, but out of sight of the convoy. He looked at the sky, which was nothing like the lowering clouds of the morning. As the day had gone on, the cloud base had lifted, but it was still overall grey, which meant that when darkness came there would be no moon or stars. Also, the wind had moderated, although that applied to both him and the chase. Yet there was no sense that it might fall away completely. This was the bite of Brittany. A calm here in March was as likely as a snowstorm in June. Yet he so nearly had the fellow. Another 2 or 3 hours, and he would pour so much shot into him that he would be forced to strike. Where was he headed?
"Mr. Burns, fetch me a glass."
The telescope, on the rise, showed him he was pursuing the Mercedes out of the port of San Malo. To the south lay the wild shore of Brittany, a place no man in his right mind would head for in darkness. Quite apart from the hazards of rocks, both submerged and above water, the tidal rise and fall was huge. The Frenchman could turn north, but with the wind fair for his home port, why bother? And if he did so, he risked at dawn finding HMS Brilliant between him and safety. The notion that he was hunting a straggler of an East Indiaman would not pass muster under malign scrutiny, but Ralph Barclay knew that if he had a capture, the examining eyes would look more kindly.
"Mr. Burns, please tell Mr. Roscoe that the hands are to be piped to supper."
Emily looked at her husband then with admiration, and he, returning that look, thought of what success would bring for her. That she was a lady was not in doubt. Neither was the fact that she would grace his rank to whatever heights he rose. In his mind he imagined the benefits she would enjoy from being a wife to a successful sailor, a taker of numerous prizes. Carriages, a beautiful home, servants, and children so well found in wealth and position that if they ever did decide to go to sea, they would do so with none of the constraints which had dogged his career.
"And, Mr. Burns, please ask Mr. Roscoe to prepare to darken ship. We are going to continue the chase once the light goes, but I have no notion to let the fellow know it."
It was ghostly sailing along in the dark. A tarpaulin had been rigged before the binnacle locker so that no light showed forward. Below decks only enough lanterns were lit to allow a man to pass from one place to the next without injury, and screens had been rigged to ensure that nothing showed aloft. HMS Brilliant ploughed on in Stygian darkness that, with solid cloud cover, allowed for no phosphorescence, either from the crest wave, the frigate's bow, or even the wake of the chase. Men were forward, one out on the bowsprit, eyes peeled for a glimmer of inadvertent light, for the chase had darkened likewise, or for some clink of sound as someone moved around the deck, able to report back to Ralph Barclay, sat in his cabin, that the odd noise could be heard as "Those lubberly French dogs moved around."
"Orders to Mr. Roscoe," Barclay replied. "Men to sleep by watches, 2 hours each. Any man making a sound I will flog to oblivion."
That such reports of noises ceased as the night wore on did not bother Ralph Barclay overmuch. He assumed that with everything set and braced, on a breeze that was holding steady, his adversary had sent most of his crew to their hammocks. He started to doze in his chair, unaware that his wife, worried about him, was having difficulty sleeping at all in the restored and screened-off cot.
"Pearce, wake up!"
Dragged from a lubricious dream that largely featured the captain's wife, naked as well as willing, and life on land and comfort, Pearce was slow to respond to the shake, reluctant to leave such an agreeable fantasy. When he did awake, it was to the immediate knowledge, through sound and smell, that he was still aboard ship. Such interruption was doubly unwelcome, given that sleeping 2 hours on and 2 off exacerbated the exhaustion of the normal 4-hour regime. Eyes open, he had to think hard to recognize the voice that was urgently repeating his name, for there was no light at all on the main deck of the darkened ship.
"Rufus,"
he guessed. Dommett answered with an urgent whisper.
"Corney's in trouble."
"Good," Pearce murmured.
"It's serious."
Pearce yawned before he responded.
"Even better."
Rufus shook him hard again.
"It's no jest, I mean it. I was on my way to the heads when I heard the clack of dice coming from one of the boats."
Still reluctant to be awake, wishing to return to the agreeable reverie of his dream, Pearce growled at Rufus. He, like some of the others, had spotted, since coming aboard, that there were any number of surreptitious activities taking place with the crew off watch. Sailors slipping away from the main deck with backward looks that could only be described as furtive. He had reckoned gambling or secret drinking, without wanting to think about anything else certain members of the crew might be getting up to in the dark corners of the lower deck.
"Then I heard that boy Dent. He were whispering, but I'm sure it were him."
That name brought Pearce fully awake. Dent?
"He was talking murder, John."
Pearce growled,
"Wake Charlie and Ben."
Swiftly he rolled out of his hammock, jostling O'Hagan to rouse him, pressing his mouth close to the Irishman's ear and using Dent's name to cut through any confusion. Michael O'Hagan was on his feet in no time at all, because he, like all the other members of the mess, was under no illusion that just because he had beaten Devereux in a fight, Martin Dent had ceased his vendetta against Pearce and Charlie Taverner, as well as all those associated with them. Ben was up in a flash, like a man who lived in the fear of a hand on his collar. It took longer to get Charlie Taverner stirring, but within a minute all 5 men were huddled under their hammocks as Rufus told what he had heard.
"It was when I were coming back that I heard a bit of a commotion, double quiet-like, but much like a bit of a scuffle, so I stops to have me a listen. Then I heard Corney's squeak. You know how he wheedles."
Pearce could not see the heads nod in the dark, but he could almost feel their reaction. The other 3 knew and disliked, just as much as he did, the tone Gerson used when he was after something.
"Any road I got a bit closer. Then I heard Dent saying that a pressed man was not to be trusted, that he might start a gabbing, and the safest way to be secure was to chuck the bastard overboard."
"No need to inquire after who's the bastard," hissed O'Hagan.
"We've got to look," said Pearce.
"Why?" demanded Charlie Taverner in a soft but bitter voice.
"That sod would see us swing as soon as look at us."
"You don't know that for sure, Charlie," whispered Ben Walker, "and he's one of our mess, for better or worse."
"If you don't move quick,"
Rufus insisted, in what for him was a rare show of determination,
"he won't be. We'll be down to 5 instead of the 7 we started with, and that little sod Dent will be hunting for another victim."
Pearce nudged Rufus to lead the way, tapping the others to follow, thinking, as they complied, they were motivated more by apprehension at what a slip of a boy might get up to next, rather than any desire to save Gerson. The need to be quiet was paramount, for the ship was still after that Frenchman. Even the Marines doing sentry duty on the quarterdeck and outside the magazine had been told to discard their shoes, lest a clicking heel carry to the enemy, and no petty officers were touring the decks, as was normal on watch. Barefoot, they made no noise at all as they slipped up the companionway steps, and, feeling the cold of the night air, scurried onto the gangway, crawling forward, ears straining for a sound, until Rufus, stopping, forced the others to do likewise. Pearce heard what had stopped him, muffled voices but disputatious, coming from under the canvas that covered what he thought would be the cutter. A good place to gamble, being out of sight, and a spot from which, under a thick tarpaulin, no light would escape. It did just then, for the briefest second, before an angry voice commanded someone to shade it, leaving Pearce to wonder at men so obsessed with their compulsion that they would take a risk on such a night as this, when Barclay would certainly flog to oblivion any man he caught alerting his quarry to his position. A grunt brought forth another command to "Silence that bugger and get him over to the bulwark." "Stop right there, mate," said Pearce, in a voice he feared was loud enough to carry to the quarterdeck, praying that the sound of the wind and the creaking of the masts and rigging would muffle it. The response was a hiss. "Who's that?" "12 mess, mate, and I reckon you have one of our number." "You're wrong, friend." A short, low moan followed, then a slight thud. Pearce knew the first had come from Gerson, and the second from whoever had hold of him. "And you be taking a right risk raising your voice so." "Dicing is a risk on its own, friend." "Who's to say what we was about?" "I don't care about that," Pearce growled, "and neither does the man you are holding." "You ain't listening, are you?" Michael had eased up beside Pearce, and it was he who replied, "For sure, it is you that is not using your ears." "It's the big Paddy," said another voice. The fellow who was the leader hissed then, "Will you cap that bloody noise?" "There's more than the big Paddy, brother," Michael added. "There's enough here to take you on and sod the noise." "You lot would suffer along with us." "Be that as it may," Pearce whispered, "it is what will come to pass. Best just let our man go." "He's like to squeal." "If I guessed gambling was going on aboard, so can those in authority." The pause before the speaker replied worried Pearce, but eventually the fellow said, "It be the sure way for quiet." "Only Martin Dent would say that, and you should be sure his aim is the same as your own." The sudden sound of scampering feet alerted Pearce to the boy's presence. It also told him that Martin was not going to hang around. "Martin who?" the sailor responded. "I am going to count," murmured O'Hagan, quiet-like, "and not past 3. If our man is not set free, then I will come into that boat and start swinging." "Get those bonds off him," the voice said after another pause. "Leave them on," said Pearce suddenly, and too loudly for safety, for he was fearful that Gerson, free to take off his gag and yell blue murder, would do just that and damn the consequences. "Just help him out and we will take him below." "If he talks—" "He won't," Pearce insisted. "You have my word on that." "I know who you are, mate, with that gent's manner of yours, and if that word is broken, it'll be you I come after." Once released, Gerson started to mumble through the gag until Michael threatened to throw him overboard. They hustled him down to the main deck, eyes fixed towards the invisible quarterdeck, sure that every sound they were making must carry to whichever officer was on watch. But nothing stirred from that area, and soon, by feel and with a writhing Gerson, they got back to the spot under their own empty hammocks, not without grunts from those whose slumber they had disturbed. "Ungag him," said Pearce, "but leave his hands." "Shut up," hissed Pearce, "or that gag goes back on. You get into your hammock, you close your eyes, and you say nothing. Do you understand?"
The reply took several seconds to emerge, and Pearce could easily imagine Gerson trying to calculate what was the best for him. The needs of the men who had just saved his life would probably not count.
"Yes," he whispered eventually. "Undo his hands. Then let's try and get some sleep."
Michael O'Hagan had the last word, speaking from his cot to a wide-awake Pearce.
"Why did we bother, John boy?"
But not the last sound. That was of sobbing coming from Gerson's hammock. Chapter 13. The time was marked without bells, each turn of the half-hour sandglass merely scored on the slate. But Barclay had left his orders, and he was on deck well before the first hint of light, whispering admonishment to the men proceeding to their battle stations to be quiet. He even went down to the main deck to talk to the bow-chaser gunners, aware as he passed each loaded cannon that not every one was manned, for he needed his topmen aloft to take in sail damned quick. With so much set, he risked a great deal if anything important was shot away by his quarry's stern-chasers. The first hint of grey produced no silhouette. That was not a worry. Both ships would have made subtle alterations to their course throughout the night, and indeed Brilliant might have head-reached the chase and be forced to come about to engage. The slow March dawn was agonizing, taking as it did almost an hour from the first tinge on the horizon until there was enough daylight to see a patch of sea-water. As the light increased, it revealed an ocean bereft of ships. Ralph Barclay waited until he could see the proverbial grey goose at a quarter of a mile, till he knew that he was alone on the water, before issuing any orders.
"Stand the men down, Mr. Roscoe, and resume normal duties once the ship has been put back to rights. Mr. Collins, we need to come about and make a rendezvous with the convoy. Pray be so good as to shape us a course."
Everything that had been struck below was brought up again and put back in place. The guns were housed, cartridges returned to the gunners, rammers, swabs, and crowbars stowed over the replaced mess tables and the makeshift benches. The only thing that was not the same as before was the mood of the ship, which ranged from quiet disappointment to spoken disenchantment. Ever since waking and thinking about what had occurred the previous night, Pearce had felt a nagging doubt. Contemplating murder was a somewhat extreme way to cover up an activity such as gambling. At his station beside the quarterdeck cannon, he had tried to examine Gerson's face for some clue to another reason. Without enlightenment, for the subject of his scrutiny would not look any of his messmates in the eye, and especially not John Pearce, confining any communication to an occasional grunt, one of which was a less than fulsome thanks. The near silence lasted through the morning rituals of cleaning and eating breakfast, and it was not until they began to carry out deck work, greasing blocks and pulleys, that Pearce could get Gerson far enough away from the others to pose some questions.
"I was not snooping," Gerson insisted, his face taking on the habitual look of a thwarted child.
"It's natural to be curious," Pearce replied soothingly, "and I myself wondered what some of the crew were up to creeping about, and I dare say the others have too."
"Who? Idiots like Taverner or Dommett? That I doubt."
Pearce was about to say that it was unwise to underestimate Charlie, but thought better of it. "It was Rufus who told us you were in danger. Odd that you have not asked how we came to your rescue."
"I am grateful. I have already said that."
Pearce thought if he was, he did not look it. "What was it those fellows were up to?"
"Gambling, of course."
"What else?" Gerson's reply was, to Pearce's ears, too emphatic.
"There was nothing else."
"So why were you there?"
"I admit to a weakness for dicing. I was looking for a way of making that known when I was set upon and dragged under the canvas."
"Silently?" Pearce asked. "You made no noise."
"I'd no chance to,"
Gerson replied, with a direct stare that challenged Pearce to disagree. That was followed by a look over his shoulder and the warning word, "Kemp." Pearce was left none the wiser.
But he was still curious, and listened with care as the others asked very similar questions to his own and ribbed Gerson for his less than convincing replies. The sight of a pair of fishing boats inshore of the frigate caused Ralph Barclay to change course and close with them, ostensibly to buy fish, but in reality to ask if they had seen his quarry. Pearce and his mates were on the foredeck, with Dysart picking shakings out of old ropes that they had been told were too far gone for use, so when HMS Brilliant came alongside they could hear the exchange of words, though only Pearce could comprehend them. Young Fairmelow was fetched forward by the captain to interpret, and made a good fist of his task, his questions about the privateer subtly interspersed with haggling over the price of the fish, which was eventually brought aboard in a basket. "You know what they are about, don't you?" asked Michael. "As you would, having lived among them." Pearce had been listening with obvious intent, ears cocked, wondering if he could drop overboard unseen and stay out of sight until the Frenchmen could pick him up. He might manage the former, but the latter was too risky. Unable to shout because that would alert the frigate, he might find himself left to drown. "I know that if those fishermen have any information about that ship we were chasing, they're not saying." "What are they saying?" Pearce smiled. "They're damning the revolution, Michael, for it has made it harder for them to get a decent price for their fish. Let's say making music for an Englishman's ears." "Is that right?" asked Dysart. Neither Pearce nor Michael had seen the Scotsman move closer to them. In answer to their look of alarm, he winked. "Dinna worry yoursel. I'll no tell anyone you speak their heathen tongue." Pearce and the Scotsman exchanged a look, a half-smile met by a nod from the sailor. Then, noticing that Dysart no longer wore his bandage, he asked, "How's the head?" "Dinna go pretending you're concerned, laddie," Dysart replied, but without rancour, lifting his hat to reveal a patch of shaved head and an ugly red scar. "They want to see your handiwork, and that right through my bloody hat." "The surgeon's done a good job." "Like hell. I'd have been better off going to the gunner's wife, cack-handed bugger that she is. At least she can use a bloody needle, for as sure as God made little apples, he canna." Pearce, smilingly, could only agree. Dysart would bear that scar for life, even if it was hidden by his regrown hair. "I promise not to do it again." Pearce got a gentle elbow in the gut. "You'll no get the chance, laddie. I'll shoot you first." Behind them, the transaction was completed. Barclay and the wardroom had their dinner, freshly caught fish, some still writhing in the basket, and HMS Brilliant parted company, resuming its previous course. In the last hour of their watch, Pearce and his mates were ordered aloft. First, they were required to climb and reclimb the shrouds. Then, when HMS Brilliant was on the starboard tack, the yards braced round so that they ran their whole length above the planking of the deck, they were being instructed on how to make their way onto the main course yard. They had come, if not to like, at least to accept climbing the main shrouds to the point where they joined with what was called the futtock shrouds, with the wind on their backs. Pearce felt reasonably secure clapped onto those ropes, even if the ship did sometimes heave over so that he was leaning backwards. Now he was required to move out into what seemed like thin air, with only a rope under bare feet to rest on, and that bordered on the suicidal. He looked at the looped lines that hung from the yard to hold that foot rope, heard them called stirrups, and reckoned the whole assembly too flimsy for security.
"Look at that, lily-livers,"
said Costello, as Michael O'Hagan, without a blink or a backward glance, put his foot on the rope and, arms and half his upper body over the yard, eased himself out. The ropes bent alarmingly, but they did support him.
"Now, if a heifer like Paddy can trust his weight to the foot ropes, so can any other man here."
His words earned him a glare from Michael, who was confident enough to free one hand to point a finger.
"Don't call me Paddy, and if I am a heifer, beware of my hoof."
Costello responded with his habitual grin, white teeth flashing, and ignored him, instead addressing Pearce, the next candidate.
"Well, Pearce, are you going to let this bog trotter shame an Englishman, or is it only swimming you can manage?"
Pearce declined to challenge the nationality, and had no desire to acknowledge the other. He took a deep breath and put out one foot.
"Call, step on," said Costello. "Let the man already on the rope know you're coming, so he'll be aware of his own footing on the ropes, which will sag with your weight. If he's not properly set, he will take a tumble."
Pearce obliged, and that was followed by a command to
"Clap onto that preventer stay,"
Costello adding, in response to a look of utter incomprehension,
"That bloody great up-and-down rope right in front of you. Haul yourself on, then do what our Irish friend did and hang your body over the yard. Right, now move on out so that the rest can follow."
Pearce, breathing deeply, hung as he was told without any feeling of security, the rope biting into the still soft soles of his feet. That was when he heard the first faint sound of gunfire, a dull boom that reverberated across the water and was more obvious to those aloft than on deck.
"Jesus Christ!"
said Costello, looking forward. "What can I do for you?" asked Michael, with a mischievous look.
"Get down now," the boatswain's mate yelled, "and stuff your jokes."
Another dull boom came floating through the grey morning air as Ralph Barclay, hatless and coatless, came on deck, his eyes straining forward.
"Masthead, what do you see?"
"Nothing, your honour."
"God damn the eyes of those fishermen! Mr. Roscoe, all hands, get the best lookouts on the ship aloft, and for God's sake, someone get me more sail!"
What followed was a repeat of the previous day, for although the wind had shifted slightly to the north, it was still not a breeze to favour the course they were steering. Brilliant was labouring into both a wind and an incoming Atlantic swell, and all the time the dull booming sound of the guns grew louder, until finally what Ralph Barclay feared most was confirmed. The ship he had been chasing all night was attacking what looked like the East Indiaman that had become detached from the convoy. Crowding on sail took no account of potential damage to the top hamper. Twice topsails blew out of their deadeyes and had to be reset. Ralph Barclay became frantic when the firing stopped, incandescent and railing at the course the Indiaman must have been sailing, which was nothing like that of the convoy. He was angry, even more so and unfairly, when he was told that Firefly was nowhere to be seen. He fell silent when informed that the Mercedes was hoisting sail and that a French ensign flew over the East India Company pennant, declaring that she had just captured the valuable prize. But despite that, he knew as he cleared for action he had a chance to redeem matters. He was between his quarry and St. Malo. If the Frenchman headed for his home port, he would have to get both bark and prize past the frigate. At the very least, he would have to abandon the East Indiaman. At best, Brilliant would take her back and board and take her captor as well.
"He is setting his course south, your honour," called the lookout.
"Damn the man!"
Barclay cried, almost wailing in frustration, casting his eyes towards the rugged North Brittany shore, just a faint grey line on the southern horizon.
"Mr. Collins, look to your charts and any profiles you have of the shoreline. Tell me where he might be headed."
Within seconds he was pacing up and down the deck, more concerned with the consequences of failure than the prospect of success. For he would find it hard to justify searching for a vessel that not only had he failed to find, but that he had allowed to be captured. Suddenly Ralph Barclay was aware of the impression he was creating, improperly dressed and very obviously agitated. He shot into his cabin, to come face to face with his wife. "There is something amiss, Captain Barclay," she said. Given his mood, the reply was sharper than necessary.
"It is nothing with which you should concern yourself. My coat and hat, Shenton," he said, breathing heavily.
It was an awkward silence that followed, one in which he could not bring himself to tell her he had been humbugged, one in which she waited in vain for him to express regret at being so brusque. That he did not do so, merely donning the called-for clothing before departing, made Emily cross. "Shenton, my cloak, if you please." The steward looked at her questioningly, but in the face of her own direct and uncompromising glare he had no choice but to oblige. She emerged onto the deck of a ship in the act of coming about, lines of men running this way and that as they adjusted and realigned their sails. Now aware of the safest place to be, she took up a position between two of the quarterdeck cannon, watching her husband too busy with Collins and his charts and shoreline drawings to notice her presence. She was still there when, with HMS Brilliant settled on her new course, the gun crew returned to their station. Pearce ignored the dig he got from Michael O'Hagan for staring at the captain's wife, now only a few feet away. He also ignored the cursed injunction to stand still as he took a step to close that gap, too busy forming some words he could use to establish contact. Unaware of the man's proximity, Emily Barclay started as if she had seen a ghost when she half-turned and he came into her eye-line. "Pearce, you are Marthorn," whispered Michael. "Look away." "Madam, you addressed me in French yesterday. Might I be allowed to ask why?" "Did I?" Emily replied, flustered, feeling the warm blood begin to fill her face as she blushed. That inadvertent use of French had been foolish in the extreme. She might as well have said to this man, "I have read your letter." "An affectation of mine, I do assure you," she lied, which made her blush even more.
End of CD 9.